Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey back to a time when the setting sun wasn't just beautiful, it was a warning. Imagine living in a world where your entire day ended, not when you were tired, but when the sun decided it was time. For women in the 1700s, twilight wasn't romantic, it was a deadline. And what happened in those hours between sunset and sleep, well, that's a story most history books forgot to tell. So before we step into the flickering candlelight of the past together, I'd love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe if you enjoy these quiet history stories. A like helps more people find this kind of content, and honestly, your comments, whether it's where you're watching from or what resonates with you, they make my day. But only if this speaks to you. No pressure. Now, let's dim the lights, maybe turn on a soft fan for that gentle background sound, and slip back 3 centuries to an ordinary evening that was anything but ordinary. Picture this, it's October 1743. Somewhere in rural Massachusetts, a woman named Sarah stands at her kitchen window, watching the sky turn from gold to amber to that particular shade of grey that means she has maybe 30 minutes of usable light left. Her hands are already moving faster. Not panicking exactly, but faster. Because when that sun drops below the horizon, everything changes. And I mean everything. You see, we think of sunset as this peaceful, gentle transition. We watch it with a glass of wine, take photos, post them with captions about gratitude. But for Sarah and millions of women like her in the 1700s, sunset was more like a factory whistle. It was the signal that her workday, which started before dawn by the way, was about to shift into a completely different kind of labour. Let me take you through what that actually looked like. First, understand this. In the 1700s, there was no such thing as flipping a light switch. There was no electricity humming quietly in the walls, no lamps that turned night into day. There was fire, there were candles, and both were expensive, dangerous, and shockingly dim by our standards. So most of the year's real work, the productive, income-generating, family-sustaining work, had to happen while the sun was up. And when I say most women organise their entire lives around daylight, I'm not exaggerating. Thomas Jefferson, that founding father we all learned about in school, kept detailed records of his household. And you know what his charts revealed? His spinners, the women who turned raw wool into thread, they produced 50% more wool in June than in December. Not because they were lazier in winter, not because wool was harder to work with in cold weather, but simply because June has more daylight hours. Jefferson's records show that these women worked only when the sun was out. He didn't even try to extend their workday with candles, because candlelight was too dim for the detailed work of spinning and too expensive to waste on labour. And that's a wealthy man's household we're talking about. Imagine the pressure on a poor or middle-class family where every penny mattered, every candle was precious. So back to Sarah at her window. The sun is setting. What happens next? It's like watching someone speed up a video. Suddenly, every woman in the household, daughters, servants if she has them, Sarah herself, they're all racing against the dying light. The chickens need to be herded into their coop and locked away from foxes. The cow needs to be brought in from the pasture. Any tools left outside need to be collected. You can't afford to lose a rake or a hoe to the darkness and have to search for it tomorrow morning. Firewood that's been drying in the yard all day? It needs to come inside now, enough to last through the night and start tomorrow's fires. Water buckets need to be filled because stumbling around a dark well after sunset is a recipe for disaster. And Sarah's mentally running through her checklist. Did she close the shutters on the eastern windows? Is there enough kindling near the hearth? Where did her youngest daughter put the tinderbox? Because here's what we forget. Starting a fire in the 1700s wasn't like lighting a match. Matches didn't exist yet. If your fire went completely out overnight, you'd need to relight it using a flint and steel, striking sparks onto charred cloth or dried moss, blowing gently until you got a flame, carefully feeding it until it grew strong enough to light a candle or a wood fire. It could take 10, 15, even 20 minutes. And in winter, those could be 20 very cold, very dark, very frustrating minutes. So the evening fire management was actually an art form. You didn't let it go out. You banked it, which meant carefully arranging the logs and coals so they'd burn slowly through the night, low enough not to be dangerous, hot enough that they wouldn't die completely, positioned so that in the morning you could blow on them and coax them back to life. That was usually a woman's job, banking the fire, keeping the home's heart beating. But let's talk about what happens when the sun actually sets. In summer, that might be 8 or even 9 at night in the northern colonies. You'd have long, leisurely twilights, that gorgeous extended dusk that makes summer evenings feel endless. But in winter? In January in Massachusetts or New York or Pennsylvania, the sun might set at 4:30 in the afternoon. 4:30. You'd finish your midday meal, which people called dinner back then, the main meal of the day, and within 2 hours it would be getting dark. And I want you to really think about that, because it means that from roughly 5 in the evening until 6 or 7 the next morning you're living in darkness. 14 hours. That's more than half your life spent in a world with no light except what you can create yourself. One historian who studied colonial Williamsburg diaries found that people described a room lit with 7 candles as appearing luminous and splendid. 7 candles. That's what counted as bright. Most families didn't have 7 candles burning at once. Most families owned fewer than 5 candlesticks total. I'll get into the economics of candles more in a bit, but for now just know this. For the average household, evening meant rationing light itself. Now, I mentioned Sarah's checklist. Let me walk you through what else is on it, because this is where it gets fascinating. As the light fades, Sarah needs to do a mental inventory of tomorrow morning. It's a trick her mother taught her and her mother before that. Whatever slows you down at dawn, handle it at dusk. So she's thinking, what will we eat for breakfast? If it's porridge, she can measure out the oats now and set them near the hearth. If it's leftover stew, she knows where it is. The wooden bowls should be stacked and ready. The big stirring spoon should be hanging in its spot. What will the children wear? Any torn shifts or stockings should be identified now, set aside for mending tonight while there's candlelight if they can afford it. Is there water in the house? Not just for tonight, but enough for the morning face washing, the breakfast cooking, the first tasks of the day? This kind of evening preparation wasn't written in housekeeping books because it was considered too obvious to mention. But travellers from cities, when they visited rural households, sometimes commented on it with surprise, this sense that the evening wasn't rest time, it was preparation time. And here's something that really struck me when I was researching this. The psychology of it. Living by the sun's schedule meant you were never really in control of your time. Not fully. You couldn't say, oh, I'll just work a bit later tonight and sleep in tomorrow. If you stayed up late, you were burning expensive candles or straining your eyes in dim firelight. And morning came when it came, whether you were rested or not. The rooster didn't care about your sleep debt. So there was this constant low-level anxiety, especially in late autumn when the days were getting shorter. Every sunset came a little earlier. Every morning you had a little less time to get things done, and winter was coming, with its long nights and cold and the need to stay indoors more. Women would talk about it in their letters and diaries. This feeling of the days slipping away, this pressure to make the most of every moment of daylight. One woman in 1768 wrote to her sister, "I find myself quite vexed on cloudy days, for it seems I lose 2 hours of light that I can ill afford to waste." 2 hours of light. Worth writing about. Worth being vexed over. Can you imagine valuing daylight that much? But here's where it gets interesting. Because women adapted, they got creative. If you visit historical houses from this period, you'll notice something. The windows are huge relative to the size of the rooms, especially on the east and west sides of the house. That's not an accident. That's not just architectural style. They built houses to capture every possible ray of sun, and inside the layout mattered too. Work that required seeing fine details, sewing, mending, reading, writing, that happened near windows, always. You'll see it in paintings from the period. Women at spinning wheels positioned right by the window, girls learning to sew on a bench that catches the afternoon light. The rest of the house could be dim. The bedroom, the storage areas, the hallway, those could be dark. But the places where detailed work happened, those needed light. And during the day, people moved their work to follow the sun. Morning tasks happened on the east side of the house. Afternoon tasks migrated west. It was a kind of domestic choreography, this daily dance with daylight. Now let's get back to Sarah as that last bit of usable twilight fades. She can't see the fine details anymore, can't thread a needle or read small print, but she can still see shapes, can still move around safely, can still finish the larger tasks. So this is when she might do a final walk around the property, check that the garden gate is latched, make sure no tools got left out in the field, look in on the animals one last time, and this is when she'd be very aware of the sounds. Because as light fades, hearing sharpens. She's listening for anything unusual. The sound of her husband or sons finishing up work in the barn. The sound of her daughters getting the younger children inside. The sound of neighbours calling to each other across the yards, everyone doing this same evening dance. In rural areas, you could actually hear the sunset happening across the community. Animals being penned, doors shutting, voices calling, children being summoned inside. One man who grew up in 1780s Virginia later wrote about this in his memoirs. The sound of evening was like a symphony, each household playing its part, and you knew when all the notes had been played that the day was truly done. I love that image, this communal sunset, this shared transition from day to night. And then there's the moment when Sarah steps back inside her house and closes the door behind her. That's it. Day is done. The outside world is now locked out until morning. Whatever didn't get done will have to wait. Whatever got forgotten is just forgotten until dawn. And now begins a different kind of evening work. The kind that happens by firelight and candlelight. The kind that's just as essential but somehow even more exhausting because you're already tired. And now you have to work in dim light and your eyes hurt and you've been on your feet since before sunrise. But that meal needs to be warmed. Those children need to be fed. That mending needs to happen. Those letters need to be written. That bread needs to be set to rise for tomorrow. Life doesn't stop just because the sun went down. It just gets harder. And here's what I find most moving about this whole thing. Women in the 1700s didn't think of themselves as particularly strong or resilient. If you read their letters and diaries, they're constantly worried they're not doing enough, not managing well enough, not keeping up. They didn't know they were living through something we'd look back on and find extraordinary. They just knew the sun was setting and there was work to be done, and the candles were expensive, and tomorrow would come whether they were ready or not. So as we move deeper into this story of evening life in the 1700s, I want you to hold on to that image. Sarah at her window, watching the light fade, her mind already racing through everything that needs to happen next. Because that moment, that transition from day to night, that's where our story really begins. In the next part, we're going to step inside that warm kitchen and see exactly what happened when supper time arrived. And trust me, it's not what you'd expect. The evening meal in the 1700s was its own little world of tradition, strategy, and making do. But for now, just picture that race against darkness, that precious light slipping away, and all those women in all those houses dancing that same careful dance with the sunset every single evening for their entire lives. So Sarah's inside now, the door is closed against the darkening October evening, and the first thing she needs to do, before anything else, before sitting down, before even taking off her outdoor shawl, is deal with supper. Now when I say supper, I need you to completely forget what that word means to you. Because in the 1700s, supper wasn't dinner, yes. It wasn't the main meal, so it wasn't even particularly important in terms of nutritional variety. Supper was something else entirely, it was leftovers. But here's the thing, leftovers elevated to an art form. Let me explain. The main meal of the day in the 1700s was called dinner, and dinner happened between noon and 3 in the afternoon. That's when you'd have your stew, your roasted meat if you could afford it, your vegetables, your bread. That's when families gathered for the substantial filling meal that would fuel the rest of the day's work. Supper, on the other hand, happened sometime between 6 and 8 in the evening, and it was almost always whatever was left from dinner, warmed up. Now you might be thinking, that sounds depressing. Cold leftovers for your evening meal? But here's where it gets fascinating, because the way women manage supper reveals something brilliant about household economy in this period. Think about it. By evening, everyone's exhausted, the light is terrible, candles are expensive, the fire needs to be managed carefully, because you can't let it go out overnight. So the absolute last thing anyone wants to do is start cooking from scratch. Instead, what Sarah would have done, what her mother taught her, what she's now teaching her daughters, is strategic meal planning centered around the hearth. That big stew pot that has been sitting over the fire since this morning, it's still there. The fire's been kept low all day, just high enough to keep the contents warm but not burning. The stew has been essentially maintaining itself, and that's the genius of it. One pot, one fire, continuous heat, minimal supervision. Let me paint you a more specific picture. It's mid-October 1743. Remember our Sarah? She made a pea and salt pork stew this morning. She started it at dawn right after breakfast. Dried peas that had been soaking overnight, chunks of salted pork from the barrel in the cellar, an onion from the storage, maybe some carrots if they haven't all been eaten yet. Herbs from the summer's drying, thyme, sage. She got it boiling, then pushed the pot to the side of the hearth where the heat was gentler. And there it sat all day while she did everything else. Feeding chickens, churning butter, mending, spinning, supervising her daughter's work, 1,000 tasks. She checked it occasionally, gave it a stir, added a bit of water if it looked too thick, but mostly it just cooked itself. By noon it was ready. The family ate their dinner portions. They sopped up the broth with bread. The children got seconds because growing bodies need fuel. And then, and this is key, Sarah left a good third of the pot untouched. That remainder has been sitting there all afternoon. The peas have gotten softer. The pork has broken down even more. The flavours have had 6 extra hours to meld together. Honestly, by supper time that stew probably tastes better than it did at noon. But warming it for supper isn't quite as simple as just ladling it out. There's a process. First, Sarah needs to assess the fire. Has it stayed strong enough? Is there enough heat to warm the stew through? Or does she need to add a log, coax the flames up a bit? This is actually a delicate judgment call. Add too much wood and you're wasting fuel, creating more heat than you need, making the room uncomfortably hot. Add too little, and the stew stays lukewarm, which nobody wants. Sarah's been doing this for 20 years. She knows her hearth like you know your oven settings. She knows exactly where to position the pot, how long it'll take, what the stew should look like when it starts to bubble around the edges. While the stew warms, she's slicing bread. Yesterday's bread, most likely, because bread was typically baked once or twice a week, not daily. It's a bit dry, but that's actually perfect for soaking up stew. The children prefer it that way. They like using bread as a spoon, pushing it around the wooden bowl until it's saturated with broth. Now, I mention wooden bowls, and that's worth pausing on, because tableware tells us a lot about how supper happened. Most families didn't have individual plates or bowls for every person. The wealthy might, but average households, they shared. Father might have his own bowl, mother might have one, but the children often ate from a common dish, or they'd share between 2 or 3. And here's something that surprised me when I learned it. Individual portions of meat and vegetables weren't really a thing until later in the 1700s, and even then, mostly for well-to-do families. For most people, you ate communally. The stew pot or the bowl sat in the centre. You had your hunk of bread, you dipped, you ate, you dipped again. It was actually quite intimate when you think about it. Everyone's bread going into the same bowl, everyone's hands reaching toward the centre. There was no such thing as my food and your food. It was all our food. Can you imagine trying to get modern kids to share a meal that way, without dividing it up into separate portions? It's a completely different relationship with eating. But let's get back to Sarah's kitchen. The stew is bubbling now, the bread is sliced, and this is where the social dynamic of supper gets interesting. Because unlike dinner, which was somewhat formal, everyone gathered, Father said grace, there was a certain order to things. Supper was looser, more casual. People might not all eat at the same time. If Father and the older sons were still finishing evening chores in the barn, they'd eat when they came in. Mother and daughters might eat earlier, because they had their own evening work to do, spinning, sewing, mending. Younger children might eat and then be put straight to bed. Older children might eat quickly and then sit by the fire with their handwork. Supper wasn't so much a meal as it was refueling. It was practical, it was necessary, but it didn't have the ceremony of dinner. And I think there's something kind of beautiful about that informality, because it meant the evening could unfold more naturally. You weren't locked into this rigid everyone must eat at the same time schedule. You adapted to the rhythms of work and light and energy. Now, I want to talk about what happened to the pot after supper, because this is where you really see the economy of household management. Whatever's left in that pot, maybe a quarter of the original stew, that's tomorrow's breakfast. Or it's tomorrow's dinner if you add more ingredients, or it's the base for a completely different dish. Nothing was wasted. Nothing. If there was too much left and it would spoil, it might go to the pigs or the dog. But that was rare, because women had this incredibly precise sense of proportions. They knew how many servings a pot would yield. They knew how much their family would eat at dinner versus supper. They knew how to stretch ingredients across multiple meals. It's almost like they had this internal spreadsheet running at all times. Not written down. Most women couldn't have explained their math if you asked them, but they knew. Deep in their bones, they knew. One historian who studied colonial household accounts found that the best household managers could make 1 pound of salted meat combined with dried peas and vegetables, feed a family of 6 across 2 full days. That's 12 meals from ingredients that cost maybe a few pennies. That's not just frugal, that's genius. But here's what I find most striking about supper in the 1700s. It reveals how different their relationship with food was. We're used to variety, right? We expect different meals every night. If you served your family leftover stew 3 nights in a row, they'd probably stage a rebellion. But in the 1700s, consistency was comforting. Knowing what you were going to eat meant one less thing to worry about. The same stew for dinner and supper, maybe with different bread or a different vegetable on the side if you were lucky. That was just normal. And more than that, it was strategic. Because cooking from scratch twice a day would have been impossibly labour-intensive. It would have required maintaining a hot fire all day. It would have demanded attention that women simply didn't have to give. The one pot, cook once, eat twice approach freed up time and energy for everything else that needed doing. The spinning, the preserving, the animal care, the child care, the endless list of tasks. Supper being simple wasn't a failure of imagination or a sign of poverty. Though poverty certainly limited options, it was intelligent household management. Let me tell you about one specific woman whose diary survived. Her name was Ruth Henshaw, and she lived in Leicester, Massachusetts in the late 1700s. She kept meticulous records of her daily life. And you know what she mentions over and over in her evening entries? How tired she is by supper time. Warmed the remains of our dinner stew. The children ate what remained of the pork and turnips. Supper was hasty, as I had spinning to finish. That word, hasty. She uses it a lot, not in an apologetic way. Just matter of fact, supper was hasty because there were 3 more hours of work to do before bed, and elaborate meal preparation didn't fit into that equation. And I think about Ruth Henshaw warming her leftover stew by firelight, probably doing it with one hand while her other hand was already reaching for the spinning wheel or the mending basket. And I think about how she didn't feel guilty about it. There was no Instagram to make her feel bad that her meal wasn't photogenic. There were no cooking shows suggesting she should try 17 new recipes this week. There was just, this is supper. It's warm. It's filling. Now let's move on to the next thing. What a relief that must have been in its own way. Of course, not every supper was leftover stew. Sometimes it was leftover roasted meat with bread and cheese. Sometimes it was porridge, cornmeal mush with milk, maybe sweetened with molasses if the family could afford it. Wealthier families might have had more variety. A supper table might include cold meats, pickles, cheese, bread, perhaps some preserves. Still not cooked fresh, but more selection. And on special occasions, Sundays, holidays, when company came, supper might be elevated. You might make fresh Johnny cakes on the hearth. You might bring out the good preserves. You might serve tea. But for ordinary evenings, for Monday through Saturday, week after week, month after month, supper was practical. It was economical. It was whatever could be managed with minimal fire, minimal light, and minimal energy. And that wasn't settling. That was survival. That was strategy. Here's the other thing about supper. It happened by firelight, not candlelight. Remember, candles were expensive, so unless you were wealthy or unless it was a special occasion, you didn't light candles just for eating. You used the light from the hearth fire, which means supper happened in this warm, flickering, somewhat dim environment. You couldn't see details clearly. Faces were half in shadow. The food itself was more sense than seen. The smell, the heat, the taste. And I wonder sometimes what that did to the experience of eating. Did it make meals more contemplative, more focused on flavour rather than presentation? Did it create a particular kind of intimacy, everyone huddled in that circle of firelight? Or was it just normal? So normal that nobody even thought about it? Probably the latter. But I like to imagine the former. So Sarah's family has eaten their supper. The bowls are stacked near the water bucket to be washed, though that might wait until morning depending on energy levels. The leftover stew has been set aside, the fire has been checked and adjusted, and now the evening's real work begins. Because supper was just the intermission. It was the brief pause between the daylight work and the candlelight work. Between outdoor labour and indoor labour. And what happened next? In those hours between supper and sleep, that's where the story gets really interesting. That's where you see women's work in its truest form, necessary, skilled, relentless, and almost completely invisible to history. But not invisible to us. We're going to look closely. We're going to see exactly what filled those evening hours after the supper bowls were set aside. Stay with me, because the night is just beginning. There's a particular smell that marked the arrival of autumn in the 1700s. Not pumpkin spice, they didn't have that. Not wood smoke, though that was everywhere. No, the smell that told you autumn had truly arrived was the smell of rendering tallow. Melted animal fat. Hot, slightly rancid, unmistakable. And for women that smell meant one thing, it was time to make candles. Now I know what you're thinking. Candles? That's what we're talking about now. But trust me, this is one of the most fascinating pieces of the whole evening life puzzle. Because candles weren't just about light. They were about survival. They were about planning. They were about a woman's ability to literally see her family through winter. Let me show you what I mean. The candle-making season typically ran from late October through early November, and the timing wasn't arbitrary. It was based on some very practical calculations. First, you needed animal fat, lots of it, and that came from butchering season, which happened in autumn when the weather turned cool enough that meat wouldn't spoil before you could preserve it. When families slaughtered cattle or sheep, and this was usually a community affair, with neighbours helping each other, the women saved every scrap of fat, the hard fat around the kidneys, which was the best quality, the softer fat from other areas, fat trimmed from meat during preservation. All of it went into barrels or crocks, stored and accumulating through the year. By late October you had your year's supply of fat ready, and now you needed to act fast. Here's why the timing mattered so much. In summer, tallow, that's rendered animal fat, won't solidify properly. It's too hot. You dip your wick into the melted tallow, pull it out, and instead of the fat cooling into a nice smooth layer, it would just drip right back off. You'd end up with a lumpy, misshapen mess. In deep winter it's too cold to work comfortably. Your hands would freeze, the tallow would harden too quickly, the whole process would be miserable. But late autumn, perfect. Cool enough that the tallow sets quickly on the wick, warm enough that you can still work outdoors or in an open shed without freezing. Plus, and this is the crucial part, you needed to make your candle supply before the days got truly short. Because making candles requires daylight. You need to see what you're doing. And once winter arrived with its 4:30 sunsets, you'd be racing darkness every single day just to keep up with daily chores. So autumn was your window, your one chance to prepare for the 6 months of darkness ahead. Now let me walk you through the actual process. Because it was far more complex than you might think. First, you had to render the fat. Raw animal fat isn't usable as is. It's full of impurities, bits of meat, membranes, blood. It smells awful. If you tried to make candles from it, they'd smoke terribly and smell even worse. So women would take that collected fat and put it in a large iron kettle, the same one they used for laundry or soap making, thoroughly cleaned, and add water. Then they'd heat it over an outdoor fire slowly for hours. The fat would melt and rise to the top. The impurities would sink or dissolve in the water. You'd skim off the clean yellowish tallow from the surface and put it into another kettle. This rendering process might take a full day or more depending on how much fat you had, and you had to watch it constantly because if the fat got too hot, it would scorch. Scorched tallow made terrible candles that gave off black smoke and an acrid smell. One woman in 1757 described it in her diary, "Spent the day rendering fat. My eyes burn from the smoke and my back aches from the stirring. But the tallow came out clean and pale. Thank the Lord. That's the reality. It was hard, uncomfortable work, but necessary." Once you had clean rendered tallow, you could actually make the candles. And there were two main methods, dipping and moulding. Dipping was the most common for average households. You'd take your kettle of melted tallow and suspend it over a steady flame to keep it liquid. Then you'd take a candle rod, basically a stick with notches cut into it, and tie your wicks to it. The wicks were usually made from twisted cotton or linen threads, sometimes hemp. And here's where it got meditative in a strange way. You'd dip the wicks into the hot tallow, pull them out, wait for the tallow to cool and harden, dip again, wait, dip again, wait. Each dip added a thin layer. You needed dozens of dips to build up a candle thick enough to burn for a reasonable amount of time. How long did this take? A good estimate from historical records suggests that making 12 decent-sized tallow candles by dipping took about 3 to 4 hours of continuous work. And remember, the average household needed roughly 300 candles to get through the year. That's 25 dozen. That's 75 to 100 hours of just dipping candles. Now you see why women enlisted their daughters to help. This wasn't a one-person job, this was an all-hands-on-deck situation. The alternative was moulding, which was faster but required equipment. Candle moulds were typically made of tin or pewter, rows of tubes you'd pour the tallow into with wicks already positioned down the centre. The advantage, you could make 6 or 12 candles at once. Pour the tallow, wait for it to cool completely, pop them out, repeat, much faster than dipping. The disadvantage, moulds were expensive, not every family could afford them, and they had to be cleaned carefully after each use, which added time, so most rural households stuck with dipping. It was free if labour-intensive. And honestly, after doing it year after year since girlhood, women got quite skilled at it. They could dip multiple rods at once, rotating through them, never waiting idle while tallow cooled. There's something almost rhythmic about it when you see historical demonstrations. Dip, lift, move to the next rod. Dip, lift, move, like a dance. A slow, slightly cellularly exhausting dance. But here's what really struck me when I was researching this, the anxiety around it. Because candles weren't just convenient, they were essential, and making them was the only time all year you could do it properly. If you got sick during candle making season, you were in trouble. If the weather turned unexpectedly cold or wet, you were in trouble. If you misjudged how much tallow you had, or if your candles turned out poorly and you had to start over, you were in trouble. And trouble meant facing winter with insufficient light. It meant going to bed at 6 in the evening because you couldn't afford to burn through your candle supply too quickly. It meant your children couldn't do their evening chores properly. It meant you couldn't sew or mend or spin in the evenings. One historical account from Pennsylvania describes a family who failed to make enough candles one autumn due to illness. The father wrote, "We lived like beasts that winter, rising and sleeping with the sun, for we had no light to extend our days." Imagine that pressure, knowing that this one task, performed in these few weeks, would determine the quality of your life for the next 6 months. And the candles themselves? They weren't great, even when properly made. Tallow candles were smoky. They gave off a greasy smell as they burned. They dripped constantly unless you kept the wick perfectly trimmed. They had a low melting point, so if you placed one too close to the fire, it would bend and slump. And the light they gave? Weak. Flickering. That statistic I mentioned earlier about 7 candles making a room luminous and splendid, those were tallow candles. 7 of them together produced maybe the equivalent of one modern 60-watt bulb. But here's the thing, they were still precious, because even weak light was infinitely better than no light at all. Women would carefully store their finished candles in cool, dark places. Basements if they had them, pantries, anywhere mice couldn't get them. Yes, mice would eat tallow candles if given the chance. And they'd ration them carefully through the winter, 1 candle per evening for an average family. Maybe 2 if there was important work that needed doing. Special occasions might warrant 3. Every candle represented hours of labour. Every candle burned was an investment consumed. Now things improved somewhat in the early 1700s when someone discovered Bayberry candles. Bayberry bushes grow wild along the Atlantic coast from New England down through the Carolinas, and their berries, when boiled, release a greenish wax that's harder than tallow, burns cleaner, and smells pleasant, almost herbal. Colonial women living near the coast started experimenting with it. The process was similar to making tallow candles, but required even more patience because you needed an enormous quantity of berries to get even a small amount of wax. Some estimates suggest it took about 15 pounds of bayberries to make 1 pound of wax, and gathering 15 pounds of bayberries meant hours of picking from thorny bushes in autumn weather. But the resulting candles, so much better. They didn't smoke as much, they didn't smell like rendered fat, they burned cleaner and brighter. Naturally, they became special occasion candles. You'd save your bayberry candles for when the minister came to visit, for Christmas, for births and weddings, for moments that deserved better light. The rest of the year you made do with tallow. And then, in the mid-1700s, came the discovery that would change everything. Spermaceti, sperm whales, those massive creatures hunted in the Atlantic and Pacific, have a cavity in their heads filled with a waxy oil. When crystallized, this spermaceti makes the finest candles imaginable. Hard, bright-burning, nearly smokeless. No smell, but here's the catch. They were phenomenally expensive. Only the wealthy could afford spermaceti candles regularly. For average families, they were completely out of reach, so the class divide extended even to candlelight. Wealthy homes could be bright in the evening, lit by clean-burning spermaceti candles. Poor and middle-class homes made do with smoky, smelly tallow rationed carefully. Even something as basic as being able to see after dark was determined by how much money you had. Does that seem unfair? It should, because it was. Let me bring this back to our friend Sarah, the woman we started with in October 1743. She spent 3 weeks that autumn making candles with her 2 eldest daughters. They rendered the year's accumulated tallow. They spent hours dipping and re-dipping until their shoulders ached and their fingers were stiff. They made 287 candles. Sarah counted them carefully as she packed them away in the cellar. She did the math in her head. She'd been doing this calculation every year for 2 decades. 287 candles, roughly 1 per night from November through April, with a few extras for emergencies or special occasions. It would be enough. Barely. If they were careful. If nobody got sick and needed a candle burning all night. If no disasters struck. And as she closed the cellar door on those carefully stacked candles, she felt what every woman felt at the end of candle-making season. Relief mixed with anxiety. Relief that the work was done. Anxiety about whether it would be enough, because there wouldn't be another chance to make more until next autumn. This was it. You know what I find most moving about this whole thing? The fact that making candles was such a defining part of women's autumn work that historians can date historical documents by references to it. A letter that mentions we began the candle making yesterday can be dated to late October or early November with reasonable certainty. A diary entry about finishing the last of the candles suggests early November. It was that universal, that predictable, that essential. Every woman in the 1700s from Quebec to Georgia participated in this ritual. Rich women supervised their servants doing it. Poor women did it themselves with their daughters. But everyone made candles in autumn. It was as fundamental to the rhythm of the year as planting in spring or harvest in fall. And yet, if you ask most people today about what women did in the 1700s, they probably couldn't tell you about candle-making season. It's been forgotten. Lost in the bigger stories about war and politics and famous men. But for the women who lived it, this was life. This was what determined whether their winter evenings would be bearable or bleak. So now you understand why that smell of rendering tallow was so significant. It meant winter preparation was happening. It meant women were doing the work that would light their homes for the next 6 months. And every evening, when Sarah lit one of those carefully made candles, she was burning hours of her own labour. She was quite literally consuming her autumn work to illuminate her winter nights. That's a different relationship with light than we have, isn't it? When you flip a switch and it just happens, instant and unlimited and cheap. But in the 1700s, light was finite, personal, earned through labour and planning and skill. And we haven't even talked yet about what happened once those candles were lit, once the evening truly began, because that's where the story deepens. That's where we see what women actually did with those precious hours of candlelight. Stay close. We're about to step into the circle of light and see evening work as it really was. The candle is lit. Finally. It's maybe 7 in the evening now. Supper is finished. The autumn darkness has settled completely outside, and Sarah reaches for her tinderboxes, strikes the flint against steel, coaxes a spark onto charred cloth, blows gently until it catches, and finally, carefully, lights one of those precious candles she made just weeks ago. And the room doesn't exactly brighten. That's the first thing we need to understand about candlelight in the 1700s. It wasn't bright. It wasn't even close to what we'd consider adequate light. It was just barely enough to keep you from being completely blind. Let me put this in perspective for you. A modern LED bulb, the kind you probably have in your house, produces somewhere around 800 to 1600 lumens. That's the measurement of visible light. Even an old-fashioned incandescent bulb gives you around 800 lumens. A single tallow candle in the 1700s, about 12 lumens. 12. That means you'd need roughly 65 to 70 tallow candles burning simultaneously to equal one modern light bulb. Now remember what I mentioned earlier about that 18th century observer who said a room with 7 candles appeared luminous and splendid. With our modern understanding, that room had maybe 84 lumens total. That's about 1/10 the brightness of a single standard light bulb. And that was considered impressive. Most evenings, most families burned 1 candle, maybe 2 if absolutely necessary, which means they were living with 12 to 24 lumens of light for the entire evening. Can you even imagine? Here's an experiment you could try at home if you wanted to understand what they experienced. Wait until full darkness, turn off every single light in your house, every lamp, every LED, every glowing clock or appliance. Get yourself 1 candle, a modern one, which actually burns brighter than tallow did. Light it, sit down with a book or some sewing, try it for 10 minutes, just 10. Your eyes will adjust, sure. Humans are remarkably adaptable, but you'll notice things. The way the light barely reaches beyond a 3-foot radius, the way shadows jump and flicker with every air current, the way you have to hold your book or your work at just the right angle to see it at all, the way your eyes start to strain and water after just a few minutes. Now imagine doing that every single evening from October through April, for hours, night after night after night. That was normal life. But the dim light wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the cost. See, we've talked about how much labour went into making candles, but we haven't talked about how expensive that labour made them in economic terms. Let's do some historical math. A skilled worker in the mid-1700s might earn about £20 to £30 per year. That is British currency, which was used in the colonies. An unskilled labourer might make £10 to £15 per year. A pound of tallow, which would make roughly 4 decent-sized candles, cost about 6pence in most colonial markets. That's 1/40th of £1 sterling. So if you needed 300 candles for the year, that's £75 of tallow, which would cost you around 37 shillings and 6pence, nearly £2. For a labourer making £10 per year, that's 1/5 of his annual income. 1/5 just for light. And remember, that's if you bought the tallow. Most families made their own candles from their own livestock, which meant the cost was in labour and opportunity. Fat you could have used for soap or sold for cash instead went to candles. Every candle represented a choice. Every evening's light was an economic decision. This is why people in the 1700s had such a different relationship with darkness than we do. We're afraid of the dark in an abstract way. It's spooky, it's unsettling, it's associated with danger, but we can banish it instantly whenever we want at virtually no cost. They lived with darkness as a constant companion. Darkness was the default state. Light was the rare exception that had to be carefully rationed. And this shaped everything about evening activities. For instance, families would gather around the single candle, not metaphorically, literally. You'd cluster as close as possible to that small circle of light because 3 feet away you couldn't see anything useful. This is actually where the phrase candlelit circle comes from. It wasn't poetic, it was descriptive. The light formed a circle and you stayed within it. Now wealthy families had options that changed this dynamic considerably. If you could afford multiple candles, say 5 or 6 burning at once, you could actually spread out a bit. Different people could work on different tasks in different corners of the room. And if you were truly wealthy, you might have candelabras or chandeliers that held a dozen candles. You might even, and this was the height of luxury, use beeswax candles instead of tallow. Beeswax candles were extraordinary by the standards of the time. They burned brighter and cleaner than tallow. They didn't smoke as much. They smelled pleasant, like honey. They lasted longer. And they cost roughly 4 times as much as tallow candles. So beeswax was reserved for churches, wealthy households, and special occasions. The average family might never burn a beeswax candle in their entire lives except at church. Can you imagine living in a world where the quality of your evening light literally depended on how much money you had? Where wealthy families could see clearly and work comfortably in the evening, while poor families squinted in dim smoky light? That was reality. Class inequality extended even to something as basic as being able to see after dark. And then there's the most remarkable innovation of the mid-1700s, mirrors and reflective surfaces. Women, and it was usually women who figured this out, discovered that if you placed a mirror or a piece of polished metal behind a candle, you could nearly double the effective light it gave off. The reflection created the illusion of a second candle without the cost of actually burning one. So in better-off households, you'd see candlesticks designed with reflective backs, or small mirrors positioned strategically behind candles, or even sheets of tin, polished until they shone, hung on walls to bounce light back into the room. One inventory from a 1762 estate in Virginia lists 6 tin sconces for maximizing candlelight as valuable enough to be specifically mentioned and valued. People were so desperate for more light that they invented ways to multiply the light they had. It's actually quite ingenious when you think about it. But let's talk about what it was actually like to work by candlelight, because this is where theory meets exhausting reality. Reading by candlelight was possible but difficult. The text had to be held at exactly the right distance and angle. Too far and you couldn't see the letters. Too close and your own shadow blocked the light. You'd constantly be adjusting position, trying to find that sweet spot. And after about 20 or 30 minutes, your eyes would start to hurt. The constant focusing, the dim light, the flickering, it was genuinely straining. Historical records show that sustained reading was considered bad for the eyes. And they were right. Extended reading in poor light does cause eye strain and can contribute to vision problems. One Massachusetts minister in 1749 wrote a letter to his son, advising him not to read by candlelight for more than half an hour at a stretch, lest you damage your sight permanently as I have done. This wasn't superstition. This was genuine medical observation based on lived experience. Sewing and mending by candlelight was even more challenging. Threading a needle in that dim, flickering light? Nearly impossible for anyone over 40. Your close-up vision naturally declines with age, and even young people struggle to see the needle's eye in 12 lumens of jumping candlelight. So women developed strategies. They'd thread multiple needles during daylight and stick them in a pincushion ready for evening use. They'd work on projects that didn't require seeing tiny details, darning stockings with thick wool, for instance, rather than embroidery. They'd also position themselves very carefully. Sit the candle on your dominant side at just the right height. Hold your work at an angle that caught the most light. Turn every few minutes to avoid eye fatigue. And they'd work together. Daughters would thread needles for mothers whose eyes were going. Mothers would hold the candle while daughters did the detail work. The whole family became a kind of cooperative light management system. But even with all these strategies, needlework in the evening was slow, difficult and frustrating. What might take 30 minutes in good daylight could easily take 2 hours by candlelight. And here's something that really struck me: the constant awareness of the candle itself. When you're working by a single candle, you're always conscious of it. Is it burning evenly? Is the wick getting too long because that creates smoke and wastes wax through dripping? Is there a draft that's making it flicker more than usual? Is it getting dangerously short? Women would trim the wick several times an hour using special scissors called snuffers. If you didn't trim the wick regularly, it would create a large, smoky flame that wasted tallow and blackened the air. And you'd constantly be gauging how much candle was left. Because once it burned down, you had a decision to make. Light another one, and continue working, or call it a night and save the rest of your supply. Most nights, unless the work was truly urgent, you saved the supply. You worked as long as one candle lasted, and when it guttered out, that was your signal. Time for bed. The candle literally set your schedule. It governed when your evening ended. Let me tell you about a specific woman named Abigail Lyman. She lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, and kept detailed household accounts from 1755 to 1770. Abigail was middle class, not wealthy but comfortable. And her records are fascinating because she tracked candle usage with almost obsessive precision. In the winter of 1758, her household used 47 candles between November and February. That's roughly 3 candles per week. But she notes that 15 of those candles were used during a 2-week period when her husband was ill and needed light through the night. Without that illness, they would have used only 32 candles across 4 months, less than 2 per week. Think about what that means. 2 candles per week for an entire household. That's roughly 3 to 4 hours of light per week beyond what the hearth fire provided. Every other hour of every evening was spent in firelight alone, which was even dimmer than candlelight and less directional. Abigail's accounts show she was acutely aware of this economy. She'd note, "Lit candle for mending John's coat, 1 hour. Lit candle for reading ledger, 30 minutes. She was literally tracking the minutes of candlelight use. That's how precious it was. And the wealthy. Their relationship with evening light was completely different. Wealthy plantation owners in Virginia or successful merchants in Boston might burn 10, 15, even 20 candles in an evening without thinking twice about it. They could afford to buy candles rather than make them. They could afford beeswax. They could afford spermaceti, which gave off the brightest, cleanest light available. Their evening gatherings, dinner parties, card games, musical performances happened in rooms bright enough to see faces clearly, to read music, to play cards without squinting. Meanwhile, 2 miles away, a farming family sat in a circle around a single tallow candle, straining to see their needlework. Same evening, same darkness outside, completely different lived experiences. And you know what's interesting? The wealthy people writing letters and diaries rarely mentioned light at all. It was so abundant for them that it wasn't worth noting. Meanwhile, people like Abigail Lyman were tracking every candle. The things you don't mention in your diary are sometimes more revealing than the things you do. Here's another aspect we haven't touched on, the fire hazard. Open flames in wooden houses with fabric curtains and furniture. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, actually. House fires were terrifyingly common in the 1700s, and candles were a major cause. A candle knocked over by a child, a candle left burning unattended, a candle placed too close to bed curtains, a candle touched by a woman's long skirt as she passed. Any of these could start a fire that would consume an entire house in minutes. So part of evening life was constant vigilance about flame. Never leave a candle unattended. Always place it in a sturdy holder. Keep it away from fabric. Check it frequently. Extinguish it completely before going to bed. Women, who were usually responsible for household management, carried this worry constantly. One careless moment could destroy everything your family owned, and in rural areas, where houses were far apart and there was no fire department, a house fire usually meant total loss. At best, you might save some furniture and possessions. At worst, people died. So that single candle giving you 12 lumens of light, it was also a potential catastrophe sitting on your table, every evening, every single one. I think what gets me most about this whole thing is how much mental energy it required. We flip a switch and forget about it. The light is just there, constant and reliable and safe and free, well, nearly free. We don't think about it at all. They had to think about it constantly, calculate it, ration it, manage it, protect against its dangers, work around its limitations. Every evening an activity had to be planned around available light. Every task had to be weighed against the cost of the candle required to accomplish it. Every moment of brightness was a conscious economic decision. That's exhausting just to think about, isn't it? And yet they did it every single night for their entire lives. It was so normal that they barely complained about it in their writings. It was just how evening was. So when Sarah sits down in her circle of candlelight to begin her evening's work, the spinning or mending or whatever needs doing, she's not just sitting down to work. She's sitting down to a carefully calculated relationship with light itself. She knows exactly how long this candle will last. She knows what she needs to accomplish before it burns out. She knows how to position herself to make the most of those 12 dim lumens. She knows to watch for drafts and trim the wick and keep the children's hands away from the flame. She's doing all of this without even thinking about it, because it's muscle memory, habit, second nature. And that candle sitting in front of her, it represents hours of her autumn labour. It represents economic calculations about household resources. It represents choices made and deferred and reconsidered. It's not just light, it's much more complex than that. And what she does in that light, the work that happens in those few precious hours between supper and sleep, that's the story we're going to explore next. Because the evening work of women in the 1700s was remarkable, essential, and completely invisible to most histories, but we're going to see it. Every stitch, every thread, every moment of it. The candle is burning, the work is waiting. Let's see what happened next. Listen. Do you hear it? It's a sound that filled almost every household evening in the 1700s. A soft, rhythmic whirring, the gentle thump-thump of a treadle, the whisper of wool being drawn and twisted, the spinning wheel. If there's one sound that defined evening life for women in this era, it was that. Not conversation, though there was plenty of that. Not singing, though that happened too. It was the sound of fibre becoming thread, hour after hour, night after night, season after season. Because here's what most people don't understand about the 1700s. Almost everything your family wore, slept under, or used for cloth was made by hand. By women's hands, often in the evening. By that dim candlelight we just talked about. Let me show you what that actually meant. Sarah's supper bowls are cleared, her single candle is burning, and now she sits down at her spinning wheel. But first, let's understand what spinning actually was, because we've lost the knowledge of it almost entirely. Spinning is the process of taking raw fibre, wool from sheep, flax from plants, sometimes cotton, and twisting it into continuous thread. Before you can weave cloth, before you can knit a stocking, before you can sew anything, you need thread. And thread comes from spinning. In our world, thread comes from factories. You buy it in neat little spools without thinking twice about it. But in the 1700s, every single inch of thread your family used had to be spun by someone, usually by the women and girls of the household, and it took forever. Historical estimates suggest that spinning enough thread for one shirt, just one man's linen shirt, required approximately 20 to 30 hours of work. Think about that. 20 to 30 hours of sitting at a wheel, drawing fibre, twisting, winding, repeating. One shirt. Now multiply that by all the shirts, shifts, stockings, sheets, tablecloths, towels, and other linens a family needed. The numbers become staggering. So evening spinning wasn't optional or leisurely. It was absolutely necessary just to keep the family clothed. Sarah would have started learning to spin when she was maybe 6 or 7 years old. First on a simple drop spindle, a handheld tool, and then graduating to the wheel once her coordination improved. By the time she was 12, she could spin while half asleep. By the time she was 20, her hands moved with barely any conscious thought. And now, at 40-something, sitting down to her wheel is as automatic as breathing. She pulls a bit of wool from the bundle beside her. It's been carded, brushed until all the fibres align earlier in the day. She attaches it to the thread already on the spindle. Her foot finds the treadle. She begins the rhythm. Press, release, press, release. The wheel spins. Her hands draw the fibre out, letting it twist as it feeds onto the spindle. It's a dance of sorts. Foot and hands working in perfect coordination, never stopping, never thinking, just doing. And while she spins, she can talk. She can supervise her daughters. She can listen to her husband read from the Bible or the newspaper. She can think about tomorrow's tasks or remember last week's events. This is the genius of spinning as evening work. It keeps the hands busy and productive while the mind is free to wander or engage with family. But let's talk about her daughters, because this is where the training system of the 1700s becomes visible. Sarah has 3 daughters. The eldest, Mary, is 16. She's at her own spinning wheel working on flax, which is more difficult than wool, requires a lighter touch, produces finer thread. The middle daughter, Elizabeth, is 12. She's still learning, so she's carding wool, preparing it for spinning. This is important work, but less skilled, and it can be done by candlelight with less eye strain. The youngest daughter, who's old enough to help, 8-year-old Hannah, is winding thread onto bobbins from yesterday's spinning. Simple, repetitive work that a child can master. This is how the knowledge passed down, not through formal instruction or written manuals, through sitting together evening after evening, watching, imitating, gradually taking on more complex tasks. Mary learned by watching Sarah for 10 years before she got her own wheel. Elizabeth is learning by watching both of them. Hannah is learning by watching all 3. By the time Hannah is 16, she'll be as skilled as her mother, and she'll teach her own daughters the same way. An unbroken chain of knowledge passed through countless generations, maintained in evening hours by candlelight. Now I want you to understand something about the volume of work involved here. One historian who studied colonial household production calculated that a typical rural family needed approximately 800 hours of spinning per year to meet their basic textile needs. 800 hours. That's the equivalent of a modern full-time job, 40 hours per week for 20 weeks. Except it was spread across all the women and girls in the household, and it mostly happened in the evenings. because daytime was filled with cooking, cleaning, animal care, gardening, and a dozen other tasks. If Sarah and her eldest daughter each spun for 2 hours every evening, that's roughly 28 hours per week between them. Across a year, that's about 1,400 hours, plenty to meet family needs with some to sell or trade. But that's 2 hours every single evening. Not most evenings, not when they felt like it. Every evening. Think about your own evenings. Do you do anything every single evening for 2 hours? Anything at all? They did. They had no choice. And here's what makes it even more demanding: the quality standards. Thread wasn't just thread, it had to be even. The same thickness to thinness throughout. If it varied, the woven cloth would be weak in some spots, thick in others. Useless, basically. It had to be twisted just right. Too loose and it would fall apart, too tight and it would be stiff and hard to work with. And it had to be clean. Any vegetable matter or dirt worked into the thread would show in the final cloth. Producing good thread required skill, attention, and consistency. It wasn't something you could do carelessly while your mind wandered completely. You needed that balance of automatic hand movement and conscious quality control. Sarah could feel with her fingers if the thread was getting too thick or thin. She could sense if the twist was right. She didn't need to look at it constantly, which was good, because candlelight wasn't great for seeing fine details anyway. She relied on touch and experience. This was expertise, real valuable expertise, but because it was women's work and happened in the home, it was considered natural rather than skilled labour, which is honestly insulting. Spinning was a craft that took years to master. Let me tell you about a specific woman whose spinning played a crucial role in American history, though you've probably never heard of her. Her name was Betsy Hager, and she lived in Connecticut during the Revolutionary War. When the British blockade cut off imported cloth and thread, the Continental Army desperately needed textiles for uniforms. Betsy organised 42 women in her town into what she called a spinning society. They met twice weekly in the afternoon, but most of their work happened in their own homes in the evenings. Over the course of the war, her network produced enough thread to make uniforms for nearly 300 soldiers. 300 men clothed because women spent their evenings spinning by candlelight. And Betsy Hager's name appears in exactly 3 historical documents. 3, despite the fact that her work directly supported the war effort. Meanwhile, we know the names of dozens of minor military officers who never saw combat. That tells you everything about whose work was considered worth recording. But spinning wasn't the only evening textile work. Let's talk about sewing and mending. After the spinning came weaving, usually done by specialists or by women during daylight hours when you could see the pattern. But once you had cloth, it needed to be transformed into useful items. And that transformation happened largely in the evening. Sarah's middle daughter, Elizabeth, who's not quite skilled enough for her own spinning wheel, is mending tonight. There's a basket beside her filled with items needing repair. Her father's work shirt with a torn seam, her brother's stockings with holes in the heels, a sheet that's worn thin in the middle. Nothing got thrown away. Ever. You mended until there was literally nothing left to mend. And mending by candlelight was challenging work. You needed to see the hole or tear clearly enough to stitch it properly. You needed to match thread to fabric. You needed to make your stitches even and strong. Elizabeth holds her work close to the candle. Too close and she risks singing the fabric. Not close enough and she can't see what she's doing. She's learned through experience exactly where that sweet spot is. Her stitches are small and neat. Sarah taught her that. If you're going to spend time mending, Sarah always says, make the repair strong enough that you don't have to mend the same spot again next month. That's the practical wisdom of someone who's been doing this for decades. Every stitch matters. Every repair needs to last. Here's something beautiful about these evening textile sessions. They created space for talk. Hands were busy, but mouths were free. This was when mothers taught daughters about more than just spinning and sewing. This was when family stories got told, when moral lessons got passed down, when questions got asked and answered. Mother, why do we twist wool and flax in opposite directions? Because wool is springy and needs a tight twist. Flax is smooth and needs a loose twist. Your grandmother taught me that when I was younger than you. Mother, when will I get my own wheel? When you can spin an even thread for 2 hours without me correcting you, same as your sister earned hers. These weren't idle conversations. This was education happening, not book learning. Most of these girls weren't learning to read, but life learning, practical knowledge, family history, values, all woven into the rhythm of spinning and sewing. And sisters talked to each other, confided things they might not say in daylight, made plans, shared secrets. The intimacy of working together evening after evening created bonds that lasted lifetimes. Now let's talk about what happened when the work was truly endless, because sometimes it was. If you were preparing for a wedding, you needed to produce an enormous amount of textiles. Sheets, towels, tablecloths, clothing. A bride was expected to bring these items into her marriage, and producing them required months of evening work. Or if someone in the family was sick and couldn't work their share, the others had to pick up the slack. More hours at the wheel, more hours mending, less sleep. Or if the family was particularly poor and needed to sell spun thread or woven cloth for cash income, the evening work increased beyond household needs. In these cases, women might spin for 3 or 4 hours every evening, might sew by candlelight until their eyes watered and their backs ached and their fingers were raw. One woman in New Hampshire in 1776 wrote in her diary, "Spun until the candle burned entire away, and I could no longer see my hands. Started to rise and found I could not straighten my back without pain. I am 27 and feel like 70. 27, 27 years old, feeling 70 because of the endless evening work. But she did it. They all did it. Because the alternative was going without, going cold, going hungry because you had nothing to trade. The work was brutal, but not doing the work was worse. Here's what strikes me most about all of this, the sheer invisibility of it. Thousands of hours of skilled labour happening in dim candlelight in homes all across the colonies, all across America, keeping families clothed, creating trade goods, supporting the economy, essential work, and it's almost completely absent from historical records. We have elaborate accounts of tobacco harvests and shipping manifests and political meetings, but the spinning that happened in those same households, barely mentioned. The mending, the sewing, the constant textile production, footnotes at best, because it was just what women did. It was expected. It wasn't considered remarkable enough to record, but it was remarkable. Every evening women sat down to work that required genuine skill, that took years to master, that was absolutely essential to daily life. And they did it by light so dim we can barely imagine it, after a full day of other labour, training the next generation while they worked. That's not just remarkable, that's extraordinary. Sarah's candle is burning lower now. She's been spinning for nearly 2 hours. The pile of spun thread on her spindle has grown. Her daughter Elizabeth has finished mending 3 items and started on a 4th. Mary has produced a good length of fine linen thread, and little Hannah, who's been winding bobbins, is starting to yawn. It's getting close to the children's bedtime. But before they can sleep, there's another set of evening rituals to be done, because the work of putting a household to bed, getting children washed and settled and safe through the night, that's its own kind of labour, its own set of skills and concerns. And it happened every evening, without fail, no matter how tired everyone was. So let's follow Sarah as she starts to wind down the textile work and shift into those final evening tasks. Let's see what it took to tuck a family in for the night in the 1700s, when darkness was absolute and cold could be dangerous and every child going to sleep safely was a small victory. The spinning wheel is slowing. The bedtime routines are beginning. Stay with us. Wait. Before we move into the bedtime routines, I need to tell you about something that happened in the quiet spaces between all this work. Something that almost never made it into the historical record, but was absolutely vital to women's survival. There were moments, rare, stolen, precious moments, when a woman's evening wasn't entirely consumed by labour, when she could claim a few minutes for herself, and what she did with those minutes tells us more about women's inner lives in the 1700s than almost anything else. Let me show you what I mean. It's later now, maybe 9 o'clock. The younger children are asleep. We'll get to how that happened in a moment. Sarah's husband has dozed off in his chair by the fire, which honestly happened most evenings after a day of physical farm work. The house has settled into that particular kind of quiet that only comes when most people are sleeping, and Sarah, who's been working since before dawn, who's cooked and cleaned and spun and supervised, who's been needed by someone every moment of the day, Sarah has 15 minutes that belong only to her. What does she do with them? She writes a letter. Now, this might not seem remarkable to us. We fire off messages constantly without thinking. But for Sarah, this is something else entirely. This is connection. This is her voice, preserved. This is her claiming space in a world that mostly demanded her silence. Letter writing in the evening was incredibly common among women who could write, which wasn't all women, but more than you might think. Literacy rates for women in New England by the mid-1700s were surprisingly high, maybe 60 to 70%. Lower in the southern colonies, but still significant. And for literate women, letters were lifelines. Because here's the thing about women's lives in this period, they were isolated. If you lived on a farm, your nearest neighbour might be a mile away. You might see people at church on Sunday, but that was group interaction, not intimate conversation. Your husband was there, but he was often exhausted and not particularly interested in the topics you cared about. Letters let you maintain relationships that physical distance made impossible. A sister who'd married and moved to another county. A friend from girlhood. A mother you'd left behind when you married. A daughter who'd gone into service in a town 50 miles away. These weren't casual notes. These were substantial letters, often running several pages, filled with news and questions and observations and feelings. Let me tell you about a specific collection of letters that survived. They're between two sisters, Mercy Otis Warren and Hannah Otis, who lived in Massachusetts in the 1750s and 60s. Mercy was married with 5 children. Hannah was married with 7. They lived about 40 miles apart, close enough to visit once or twice a year, but far enough that letters were their primary connection. And these letters are extraordinary. They talk about books they've read, political events, their children's health and behaviour, the challenges of managing households, their fears and hopes, their frustrations with husbands who didn't always understand or appreciate their work. In one letter from 1763, Mercy writes, "I sit by the smallest measure of candlelight to pen these words, as the hour is late and I must conserve our supply. But I find I must write to you, dear sister, or I shall forget what it is to speak of things beyond tomorrow's bread." Read that again. Read. "Or I shall forget what it is to speak of things beyond tomorrow's bread." She needed the letters to remember that she was more than just a worker, that she had thoughts beyond domestic tasks, that she was a person with an interior life. And here's what makes this even more poignant. These letters were often written in stolen moments, after everyone else was asleep, before anyone else woke, in those gaps between tasks when no one was demanding attention, because women were expected to be available always to everyone. A woman sitting still, doing nothing but writing, was often seen as shirking her duties. Never mind that her husband might sit and smoke a pipe for an hour. Never mind that he might read the newspaper at his leisure. A woman writing a letter for personal connection, that had to be justified, had to be squeezed into moments when no one could object. The letters themselves often acknowledge this. I must make haste as I hear the baby stirring. I write in the margins of evening, hoping no one needs me for a few moments more. Please forgive this brief note, but the bread will not bake itself. Even in claiming time for themselves, women apologized. Does that make you angry? It should, because it's profoundly unfair. But letters weren't the only thing women did in these hidden moments. Some kept diaries, and oh, these diaries, they're windows into lives that were otherwise completely invisible. The most famous is probably Martha Ballard's diary, which she kept from 1785 to 1812. Martha was a midwife in Maine, and her diary is now recognized as one of the most important documents of women's work in early America. But there were countless others. Women who kept brief daily records. Baked bread, churned butter, delivered Hannah Smith of a daughter, spun 2 skeins of wool, too tired to write more. These weren't literary masterpieces, they were often just lists. But they're invaluable because they show the truth of women's work, the sheer relentless quantity of it. And many of these diaries were kept in the evening by candlelight in whatever moments women could carve out for themselves. Some women read. Now, reading by candlelight was difficult, as we've discussed. Eye strain was real, but for women who loved books, it was worth it. What did they read? Bibles, of course, that was the most common book in any household. Almanacs, which contained practical information mixed with entertainment. Conduct books about proper behaviour, though I suspect many women read these with some scepticism. And novels. Yes, novels. They were becoming more popular in the mid to late 1700s, and women were their primary audience. But novel reading was controversial. Many people, especially men, thought novels were dangerous for women, too exciting, too likely to give women unrealistic ideas about romance or adventure, too likely to make them dissatisfied with their ordinary lives, which is, if you think about it, an admission that women's ordinary lives were pretty unsatisfying. So women who read novels often did it secretly, in those evening moments when no one was watching. They'd hide the book under their sewing when someone came into the room. They'd claim they were reading the Bible when they were actually reading a story. One woman in Pennsylvania in 1770 wrote in a letter to her friend, "I have finished reading Pamela and found it most affecting. I read the final chapters last evening by the dying candlelight, weeping over the pages. My husband asked what troubled me, and I told him I was thinking of my mother, God rest her soul. I do not think he would understand why a novel might move me to tears." She had to lie about crying over a book, because admitting she was moved by fiction would have seemed frivolous or silly. And then there was handwork that was purely for pleasure. Most evening sewing was practical, mending, making necessary clothing. But some women, when they had a few extra minutes, would work on decorative pieces, embroidery, fancy needlework, samplers. Now, you might think this is still work, and in a sense it is, but there's a difference between mending a torn shirt because it needs to be done and embroidering a pattern because you find it beautiful. The second one is creative expression. It's art. And women in the 1700s were often quite skilled artists with needle and thread. They'd create elaborate designs, flowers, scenes, verses. These pieces might decorate their homes or be given as gifts. They represented hours of patient work, but work done for joy rather than necessity. Of course, this kind of work could only happen when all the necessary work was finished, which meant it happened rarely. Maybe on a Sunday evening, which was supposed to be a day of rest, though women still had to cook and clean on Sundays, just not as much. Maybe in the long summer evenings when daylight lasted late. But when it happened, it mattered. It was a way of saying I'm not just a worker. I am also someone who creates beauty. Let me tell you about something fascinating I discovered while researching this. There's evidence that some women used evening hours for what we might call intellectual pursuits. A woman named Esther Edwards Burr, she was the daughter of the famous preacher Jonathan Edwards, kept a journal in the 1750s that reveals she spent evenings reading philosophy and theology, serious, complex texts, and she thought deeply about them, recorded her responses, engaged with ideas. She wrote, "I believe the hardest work I do is entertaining," by which she meant hosting guests and managing social obligations. But the work that most engages my mind happens late in the evening, when I can finally sit with my books and think. Think about that. A woman in 1756 sitting by candlelight reading philosophy, thinking deep thoughts, and then writing in her journal, "I am ashamed that I spent my Sabbath doing nothing but attending church and playing with my daughter. I accomplished no improvement of my mind." She felt guilty for not being intellectually productive enough. This wasn't unusual for educated women. They craved mental stimulation. They wanted to engage with ideas, and the only time they could do it was in stolen evening moments. Now, I need to be honest about something. These hidden hours, these stolen moments, they weren't available to all women equally. Wealthy women with servants had more flexibility. If someone else was doing the cooking and cleaning, you had more evening time for letters or reading or creative work. Poor women, especially women who hired out their labour or who had many children, often had no time at all for themselves. Their evenings were entirely consumed by necessary work until they collapsed into bed from exhaustion. So when we talk about women claiming time for themselves in the evening, we're often talking about women with at least some economic privilege. The poor woman's hidden hours were even more hidden, or they didn't exist at all. And enslaved women, they had virtually no time that belonged to themselves. Their labour was owned by others, from before dawn until after dark. Any moment they carved out for personal life, for their own families, their own thoughts, their own humanity, was stolen from a system designed to extract maximum work from them. So this story of evening autonomy is complicated. It existed for some women, it was desperately limited for most, and it was almost impossible for the most vulnerable. But here's what I find moving about even the smallest stolen moments. Women protected them fiercely. They'd wait until everyone was asleep to pull out their writing paper. They'd wake extra early to read a few pages before the day's demands began. They'd work as efficiently as possible to create 15 minutes of their own time at the end of the evening. Because those minutes mattered. They were proof that you were more than just a pair of hands. They were space to be yourself, to connect with your own thoughts, to remember who you were beyond a mother, wife, worker, caregiver. One historian who studied women's diaries and letters called these moments cracks in the wall of necessity. The wall was there, the endless demands, the unrelenting labour. But women found cracks. They slipped through into space that belonged only to themselves. And what they did in those spaces, writing, reading, thinking, creating, those acts, were revolutionary. They were quiet revolutions, private revolutions, but revolutions nonetheless. Sarah has finished her letter now. It's to her sister who moved to Rhode Island when she married 8 years ago. Sarah writes to her every few months, and her sister writes back. The letters take weeks to arrive, travelling through informal networks of people headed in the right direction. But they arrive. And when Sarah receives a letter from her sister, she saves it, reads it multiple times, sometimes reads old letters again when she's feeling lonely or overwhelmed. This connection, maintained by candlelight in stolen moments, is what keeps her feeling human, feeling like herself. She folds the letter carefully. She'll give it to the peddler when he comes through next week. He knows to take letters to the post. It'll cost her a few pennies, but it's worth it. And now, truly, it's time for bed. But before Sarah can sleep, there are other things that need doing. Things only she can do. Things that happen every night without recognition or acknowledgement, but that are absolutely essential to her family's survival and safety. Let's follow her through these final tasks of the evening, because this is where you see the full weight of a woman's responsibility, even in the moments before sleep. Stay close. The night isn't over yet. Hannah is rubbing her eyes now. The 8-year-old who was winding bobbins earlier has reached her limit. She's trying to stay awake, trying to keep helping, but her head keeps nodding forward. Her hands have stopped moving. Sarah sees this, mothers always see this, and makes a decision. The evening work can wait. The child needs sleep. Come, Hannah, time for bed. And with those simple words, another layer of evening labour begins. Because getting children to bed in the 1700s wasn't just about tucking them in. It was a complex ritual involving water, prayers, warmth, safety checks, and a mother's constant vigilance against all the dangers that darkness might bring. Let me walk you through what this actually looked like. First, there's the matter of washing. Now, I need to be honest about something. Daily bathing wasn't a thing in the 1700s. Full immersion baths at home were rare. They required heating enormous amounts of water, which took forever and used precious fuel. Public bathhouses existed in some cities, but most rural families never went to them. But that doesn't mean people were completely filthy. That's a myth we need to dispel. Most households practice what we'd call a sponge bath or a wash-up. Face, hands and feet, the parts that got dirtiest, were washed regularly, often before bed. So Sarah takes Hannah to the water bucket. It's been sitting there all day, so it's cold. In winter, it might be painfully cold. But cold water is what they have, so cold water is what they use. She dips a cloth in the water, wrings it out and washes Hannah's face, gently around the eyes, behind the ears where dirt accumulates, the back of the neck. Hannah stands still for this, half asleep, letting her mother's hands work. Then the hands, both sides, between the fingers, under the nails if they're particularly dirty, and finally the feet, because Hannah's been running around all day in thin stockings and leather shoes that don't really protect against dirt. This whole process takes maybe 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes are intimate, caring. A mother's hands on her child's skin washing away the day's dirt, preparing her for the vulnerability of sleep. Now they move to the bedroom, and here's where we need to talk about sleeping arrangements, because they were very different from what we're used to. Most families did not have individual bedrooms for each child. In fact, most families didn't have individual beds for each child. Space was at a premium. Heating was expensive. Sharing beds was the norm. Hannah sleeps with her older sister Elizabeth. They have a bed, an actual bed frame with a rope lattice supporting a straw mattress, in the small bedroom they share with their parents. Sarah and her husband have their own bed. The eldest daughter Mary sleeps in the loft above. The boys, if this family had boys, might sleep in a different room or in the loft. Or they might sleep in the main room by the fire if it was winter and they needed the warmth. Sleeping arrangements were practical, not private. You slept where there was space and where you'd be warm enough to survive the night. Sarah helps Hannah into her night shift, basically a long linen shirt that serves as both underwear and sleepwear. These were worn day and night, with regular clothes on top during the day. At night, you removed the outer layers but kept the shift on. Hannah climbs into bed next to Elizabeth, who's already there. The older girl automatically shifts over, making room, not even fully waking. They've shared this bed for years. They know each other's sleeping patterns, each other's breathing, each other's dreams. And now comes perhaps the most important part of the bedtime ritual, prayers. Evening prayers were not optional in most 1700s households. They were as essential as food or shelter. They were how you kept your family safe through the dangers of night. Because people genuinely believed that night was dangerous. Not just physically, though it was that too, but spiritually. Darkness was when evil spirits might roam, when illness might strike, when death might come. Prayers were protection. They were insurance. They were a mother's way of wrapping her children in safety when physical protection wasn't enough. Sarah kneels by the bed. Hannah folds her hands, and together they recite prayers that Hannah has known since she could talk. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Does that prayer sound familiar? It's been around for centuries. And notice what it says. If I should die before I wake, not when I'm old, or not someday far in the future, before I wake, tonight, during sleep. Because child mortality was a constant present reality. Children died, often, from fevers, from accidents, from illnesses we can easily cure now. 1 in 3 children didn't survive to adulthood. Some estimates put it higher. So when Sarah prays with Hannah, she's genuinely asking for her daughter's survival through the night. This isn't metaphorical. This is a mother's desperate hope that her child will still be breathing when morning comes. And then there are the more personal prayers, the ones Sarah teaches her daughters to add after the formal prayer. Bless Mama and Papa, bless Mary and Elizabeth and all my family. Keep us safe and warm, help me to be good, amen. Simple words from a child's mouth, but they're teaching something crucial, the habit of reflection, the practice of gratitude, the discipline of thinking beyond yourself. Sarah adds her own prayer, spoken softly. Lord, watch over this child. Keep her from harm. Let her wake healthy and whole. Guide her steps and guard her heart. It's beautiful in its way, and heartbreaking because Sarah knows from experience, from losing siblings of her own, from burying neighbours' children, that prayer doesn't always protect, that sometimes, despite everything, children die. But she prays anyway. Because what else can she do? Now Sarah checks the bed itself. Are the blankets sufficient? In October they probably are, but come December, January, February they'll need more. Extra quilts, maybe heated bricks wrapped in cloth placed at the foot of the bed. In the coldest weather, the children might sleep in their outer clothes under piles of every blanket the family owns. Cold was a serious danger. Houses in the 1700s were poorly insulated, windows were drafty, fires banked down at night to conserve fuel. The temperature inside could drop to barely above freezing in winter. Hypothermia was a real risk, especially for the very young and very old. So checking warmth wasn't paranoid, it was necessary. Sarah tucks the blanket around Hannah's shoulders, checks that Elizabeth is covered too, makes sure there are no gaps where cold air might creep in, and then she does something that seems almost superstitious but was common practice. She places a chamber stick, a small candle in a holder with a handle, on the table near the bed. Not lit. That would be a fire hazard. But there, ready, in case someone needs light during the night. In case Hannah wakes frightened and needs to see her surroundings. In case someone becomes ill and needs tending. The chamber stick was a tool, yes, but it was also a symbol of a mother's preparedness, of her constant vigilant readiness to meet whatever needs might arise in darkness. But before Sarah can leave the room, there's one more thing, the thing that perhaps matters most of all. A lullaby. Now, We don't have recordings of how mothers in the 1700s sang to their children, but we have the words of the songs. They've been passed down mother to daughter for generations. Some of them are still sung today, though we might not realize how old they are. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mamma's going to buy you a mockingbird. Lavender's blue, dilly dilly, lavender's green. When I am king, dilly dilly, you shall be queen. All the pretty little horses, hush-a-bye, don't you cry. Go to sleep, little baby. These weren't just entertainment. They served multiple purposes. First, they soothed. The repetition, the gentle melody, the familiar words, all of this helped children transition from wakefulness to sleep. Second, they taught. Many lullabies contained lessons or stories. They passed down cultural knowledge. They reinforced values. And third, they connected. A mother's voice singing in the darkness created a bond that transcended words. It said, I am here, you're safe, I will watch over you. Sarah sings to Hannah now, not loudly. Elizabeth is already asleep, and Sarah doesn't want to wake her. Just softly, barely above a whisper. An old song her mother sang to her, and her mother's mother before that. Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee, all through the night. Guardian angels God will send thee, all through the night. Hannah's eyes are closing, her breathing is slowing. The 8-year-old's body is finally surrendering to the exhaustion that's been building since dawn. Sarah keeps singing, even after she knows Hannah can't hear her anymore, because it comforts her too, because singing is a way of coping with the worry that comes with motherhood. Because if she's singing, she's doing something, and doing something feels better than just standing there acknowledging how helpless she actually is to protect her children from every danger. Soft the drowsy hours are creeping hill and vale in slumber sleeping, and my loving vigil keeping all through the night. The song ends. Sarah stands there a moment longer, looking at her daughters in the dim firelight that reaches this room. 2 children safe for now, 2 more heartbeats continuing through another night. She breathes a prayer of thanksgiving, and then, finally, she leaves them to sleep. But her work isn't done, because she has 2 more children to settle. The older girls, Mary and Elizabeth. Well, Elizabeth is already asleep, and Mary is old enough for them to manage her own bedtime. But in families with more children, with younger children, this ritual would repeat multiple times, multiple children to wash and pray with and tuck in and sing to. And every single child was a separate act of care, a separate investment of time and attention and love. The historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who studied women's work in early America, calculated that a mother with 5 young children might spend an hour and a half every evening just on bedtime routines. An hour and a half every single night. And this was after a full day of other work. After cooking and cleaning and preserving and spinning, after everything else. Motherhood didn't pause in the evening, it intensified. Because evening was when children needed comfort and security, when they needed to be prepared for the vulnerability of sleep, when they needed their mother's vigilance most. And here's something that breaks my heart every time I think about it. Mothers in the 1700s lived with constant fear. Fear that their children wouldn't wake, fear that a fever would develop overnight, fear that a cough was actually the beginning of something deadly, fear that cold would overcome inadequate blankets, fear that fire would start from a fallen candle, fear that some unseen danger would steal their children in darkness. This wasn't irrational anxiety. These were real risks that killed real children with horrifying regularity. So when Sarah stood by her daughter's bed and sang that lullaby, she wasn't just helping them sleep, she was warding off her own terror. She was performing an act of hope in the face of genuine danger. Guardian angels God will send thee all through the night. She had to believe that. Because the alternative, that she was powerless, that her children's survival was random chance, that all her care might not be enough, that was unbearable. Sarah closes the bedroom door softly. The house is quieter now. Her husband is still dozing by the fire. The spinning wheel sits silent. The candle has burned down considerably, and Sarah realizes how tired she is. Bone tired, soul tired. The kind of tired that comes from 14 hours of constant responsibility. But she can't go to bed yet. There are still things to check, tasks to complete, the household to secure for the night. Because even in these final minutes before sleep, even when exhaustion is dragging at her like a physical weight, a woman's work continues. The evening isn't over until she says it is, until she's satisfied that everyone and everything is as safe and prepared as she can make them. And that's where we're going next, into these last moments of the evening, when a woman walks through her house one final time, checking, securing, preparing, when she does the invisible work that no one sees, but everyone depends on. The children are asleep, but the mother's vigil continues. Come see what that means. Not every evening was the same, of course. Most nights followed the pattern we've been exploring: supper, work, children to bed, the quiet rhythm of a household winding down. But some evenings were different. Some evenings there was company. And when company came in the 1700s, everything changed. The entire evening transformed from private labour into public performance, from survival into spectacle, from women's invisible work into visible hospitality. Let me show you what that looked like and what it cost. Imagine it's a Thursday evening in November, 1743. Sarah received word 3 days ago that her husband's brother and his wife would be passing through on their way to visit relatives in the next county. They'll stop for an evening visit and supper. 3 days' notice. That's both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because Sarah has time to prepare. A curse because the preparation is enormous and she has to fit it around all her regular work. The cows still need milking. The bread still needs baking, the spinning still needs doing. But on top of all that, now she needs to prepare for company. And preparing for company in the 1700s wasn't like texting come over and ordering pizza. It was a production that required days of planning, hours of extra work, and a performance of domestic competence that would be judged by everyone present. First, there's the house itself. It needs to be cleaner than usual. Not just functionally clean, but spotlessly clean. Sarah spent Wednesday afternoon, time she would normally spend on other tasks, sweeping every corner, wiping down surfaces, checking for cobwebs. The main room where guests would be received needed to be perfect. No dust on the mantel, no ashes spilled from the hearth, no clutter from daily life visible. Because a clean house wasn't just about hygiene, it was about respectability. It showed that you were a good housekeeper, that you had your household under control, that you were worthy of respect. Messy house, messy life. Dirty house, lazy woman, that's what people would think. And in small communities where reputation mattered enormously, you couldn't afford that judgment. So Sarah cleaned. And while she cleaned, she worried. Would it be enough? Would her sister-in-law notice the worn spot in the curtain? Would her brother-in-law see the crack in the plaster that she hasn't had time to fix? This anxiety was real. Historical letters are full of women expressing worry about their houses being judged by visitors. One woman in Connecticut in 1768 wrote to her sister, "I am quite vexed with anxiety over Tuesday's visit. My house is humble, and I fear Mrs. Williams will find it wanting." The performance of hospitality began before the guests even arrived. Then there's the food. Oh, the food. Ordinary supper, warmed up stew wasn't good enough for company. You needed to prepare something special, something that showed effort and skill and generosity. For Sarah's brother-in-law's visit, she's planned carefully. She's made a meat pie using some of their precious stores of preserved pork. She's baked fresh bread, not the day-old bread the family usually eats at supper, but fresh, warm bread. She's churned butter especially for the visit. She's brought up preserved fruit from the cellar, apple preserve she made in September, saved for occasions like this, and she'll serve tea, real tea with sugar if they have it. Not the herbal infusions the family drinks daily, but actual imported tea, expensive, special, a symbol of hospitality. All of this preparation took hours spread across 3 days. Hours stolen from other work, from rest, from the tiny pockets of personal time we talked about earlier. All of it to create an evening that would last maybe 3 or 4 hours. But here's what's fascinating. The effort was expected to be invisible. A good hostess made it all look effortless. She didn't complain about the work. She didn't mention how tired she was or how much preparation it took. She smiled and served and acted as if this was no trouble at all. One conduct book from 1752 advised women, "The gracious hostess never mentions her labours. She welcomes guests as if their presence alone is sufficient reward for any trouble taken." In other words, do enormous amounts of work, then pretend you didn't. Can you imagine? You spend 3 days preparing, you're exhausted, your regular work has piled up, and you have to act like it was nothing. Like magic elves came and prepared everything while you sat around being delightful. It's honestly insulting, but it was the expectation. So the guests arrive just as darkness is settling. They're welcomed in, outdoor clothes are removed and hung, greetings are exchanged. How was your journey? How are the children? How is your health? And then comes the social choreography of the evening visit. First, everyone gathers in the main room. The good chairs, the ones that don't wobble, are offered to the guests. Sarah has lit not 1 but 3 candles for this occasion. 3! The room is positively bright by usual standards. The fire has been built up higher than normal too. Partly for warmth, you don't want guests to be cold, but partly for light and atmosphere. A good fire suggested prosperity and welcome, and now Sarah must manage multiple roles simultaneously. She's the hostess, directing conversation and ensuring everyone is comfortable. She's the servant, fetching items and serving refreshments. She's the performer, demonstrating her competence and grace. And she's the surveillance system, watching and listening to everything, ready to respond to any need before it's even expressed. It's exhausting, but it's expected. Tea service is its own ritual, and in the 1700s, tea drinking had become an incredibly important social practice. Sarah brings out the tea equipage. That's what they called it. The teapot, the cups, the sugar bowl, the cream pitcher, maybe even a proper tea tray if the family has one. Tea drinking was ritualized and gendered. The woman of the house was responsible for preparing and pouring the tea. This was her domain, her performance of refinement and civilization. She heats water in a kettle over the fire. When it's boiling, she pours it over the tea leaves in the pot, lets it steep for precisely the right amount of time, too short and it's weak, too long and it's bitter. Then she pours it into cups, offers cream and sugar to each guest according to their preference. All of this is done gracefully, conversationally, as if it's the easiest thing in the world, as if she's not constantly calculating, is the tea the right strength? Is there enough for everyone to have a second cup? Am I pouring too much or too little? Is the sugar bowl running low? One historian who studied tea culture in colonial America noted that tea service was a performance of femininity as much as hospitality. Women were judged on their tea-making skills. A properly managed tea table suggested domestic competence. A poorly managed one suggested inadequacy. The stakes were real, even if the activity seems trivial to us now. With the tea comes conversation. And here's where women had to demonstrate yet another skill. the ability to be interesting without being improper. A good hostess kept conversation flowing. She asked questions, she shared appropriate news, community gossip, family updates, observations about weather or crops or local events. She guided discussion away from controversial topics like politics or religion, unless the guests were close family and such topics were safe. She also needed to be educated enough to converse intelligently, but not so educated that she seemed immodest. She needed to be witty but not sharp, informed but not opinionated, entertaining but not attention-seeking. It was a tightrope walk, and women's letters show how stressful they found it. Mercy Otis Warren, remember her from our discussion of letters, wrote to her friend in 1765, "I find entertaining exhausting, not because of the labour, though that is considerable, but because I must perform being pleasant while actually being quite anxious I shall say something wrong or fail to say something right." That's the hidden burden of hospitality. Not just the work, but the emotional labour of managing everyone's experience while managing your own anxiety. After tea might come entertainment. And here's where things get interesting. Card games were enormously popular in the 1700s. Not just among wealthy people, though they had fancier cards and more elaborate games, but among middle-class families too. The games varied. Whist was popular, cribbage, loo, piquet. Many of these games involved gambling, though usually for small stakes, maybe pennies, maybe tokens that would be redeemed for small prizes. Women played cards right alongside men. This was one of the few mixed-gender social activities where women's participation was not only accepted but expected. A woman who didn't play cards was actually at a social disadvantage. She couldn't participate fully in evening gatherings. But here's the catch. Women had to play well enough to be entertaining, but not so well that they beat the men too often or seemed too competitive. They had to enjoy the game but not appear too interested in gambling. They had to be engaged but not intense. Once again, women's participation came with strings attached. You could play, but only in the right way with the right attitude, displaying the right amount of skill and interest. In some households, wealthier ones usually, there might be music. If there was a pianoforte or harpsichord in the house, the young women of the family would be expected to play. This was a display of accomplishment, of education, of refinement. But again, there were rules. You played well enough to be admired, but not so well that you seemed to care too much about your performance. You played pieces that were pretty but not too complex, because complex music suggested you'd spent too much time practicing, and women weren't supposed to be too devoted to any single pursuit except maybe needlework. And you stopped when asked. You didn't play too long, you didn't draw too much attention to yourself. You used your musical skill to enhance the gathering, not to dominate it. One young woman in Virginia in 1753 wrote in her diary about an evening party. "I played 3 pieces on the harpsichord. Mamma said it was sufficient. I wished to play more, but understood I must not seem too eager." The constraint is visible even in things that were supposed to be enjoyable. These evening gatherings usually lasted 3 to 4 hours, from roughly 7 or 8 in the evening until 10 or 11. By the standards of the time, that was quite late. Eventually the guests would indicate their intention to depart. More rituals followed. Outdoor clothes retrieved, thanks expressed, invitations issued, "You must visit us next month." Farewells repeated multiple times. And finally the guests would leave, the door would close, and Sarah would look at the disaster left behind. Used teacups, card tables to be cleared, chairs to be returned to their usual places, the fire to be damped down, crumbs to be swept, the good tablecloth to be folded and stored. All the ordinary evening work she would have been doing, it hadn't disappeared. It had been pushed aside, and now it was waiting for her, along with the clean-up from the party. By the time everything was put away, it might be midnight, and Sarah would need to be up before dawn to begin the next day's work. Entertaining wasn't a break from labour, it was additional labour, performed while pretending it wasn't labour at all. But here's the thing that makes this complex. Women often genuinely enjoyed these gatherings. Yes, they were exhausting. Yes, they required enormous work. Yes, they came with anxiety and performance pressure and judgment, but they were also connection. They were conversation with someone other than your immediate family. They were a chance to wear your better dress and use the good dishes and feel like you were living, not just surviving. They broke the monotony of identical evenings. They created memories. They maintained relationships that sustained you through hardship. So women prepared for them despite the burden. They looked forward to them despite the anxiety. They performed hospitality despite the cost. Because humans need more than just survival. We need connection. We need occasion. We need moments that feel special, even if creating those moments nearly kills us with exhaustion. Sarah is putting away the last teacup now. Her husband has already gone to bed. His part of the evening ended when the guests left. But Sarah's part continues because someone needs to restore order. Someone needs to prepare the house for the next day. Someone needs to ensure that when morning comes, everything is as it should be. That someone is always her. She's been awake and working for 18 hours now, maybe 19. She's exhausted beyond anything we can probably imagine. Every muscle aches. Her eyes burn, her feet hurt, but she's not done yet. There are still a few final tasks, a few last checks, the things she does every single night, whether there's been company or not. And those final preparations, that last walk through the house before bed, they reveal something essential about women's role in the 1700s, about the invisible labour that held everything together, about the quiet vigilance that no one noticed but everyone depended on. Come with me through these last moments. Let's see what it took to finally put the evening to rest. There's a sound Sarah pauses to listen for every evening just before she can finally rest. She stands still in the main room, quieting her own breathing, and listens. Silence from the children's room. Good. No crackling from the chimney that might suggest a spark has caught somewhere it shouldn't. Good. No wind rattling the shutters in a way that suggests they've come loose. Good. And then she listens to the silence itself. The absence of sound from beyond the walls. The darkness outside pressing against the house like something with weight. This is the part of evening life in the 1700s that's hardest to recover from historical records. Not the work, that left traces. Not even the social interactions, those got recorded in letters and diaries, but the fear, the constant quiet anxiety that lived in the background of every evening, that mostly stayed silent. Unspoken, but it was there, always there. Let me try to help you understand what it felt like. Fire was the most immediate constant threat. We've touched on this before, but I need you to really grasp how ever-present this danger was. You're living in a wooden house. The walls are wood, the floor is wood, the ceiling is wood, much of the furniture is wood. There might be fabric curtains, woolen blankets, linen hanging to dry. Everything in your environment is combustible. And your light sources? Open flames, candles with exposed wicks that could tip over, fireplaces with sparks that could leap onto the hearth and then onto the floor. Oil lamps if you were wealthy enough, but those could spill and ignite. House fires were devastatingly common. And once a fire started in a wooden structure, it moved fast, terrifyingly fast. You might have minutes, literally minutes, to get your family out before the entire building was engulfed. And in rural areas, where houses were spread far apart, there was no fire department coming to help. No neighbours rushing over with buckets fast enough to make a difference. If your house caught fire at night, you lost it, almost certainly, along with everything you owned. So part of Sarah's evening routine every single evening is checking for fire hazards. She walks through the house with her candle, looking. Is there anything too close to the hearth? Has a spark landed on the floor without her noticing? She sweeps her hand across the hearthstones to make sure no ember has rolled out onto the wood. She checks each candle she's burned that evening. Are they completely out? Sometimes a wick can smoulder even when you think it's extinguished. She pinches each one between her fingers to be absolutely certain. She looks at the bedroom where the children sleep. The chamber stick she placed there. Is it in a safe location? Far from the bed curtains? On a stable surface where it can't be knocked over if someone stirs in the night? And then she goes back to the main hearth and does the most important task of the evening. Banking the fire. We've mentioned this before, but let me explain what it actually involves and why it matters so much. Banking the fire means arranging it so it will burn slowly through the night, hot enough to stay alive, controlled enough not to be dangerous. You want it to last until morning so you don't have to relight it from scratch, but you also want it contained. Sarah uses a poker to push the burning logs together, close but not too close. She wants them to burn slowly, consuming each other's heat rather than flaring up. Then she takes ash from the edges of the hearth and carefully, so carefully, layers it over the burning wood. Not enough to smother the fire completely, but enough to slow the burn, to bank the heat. It's a delicate process. Too much ash and the fire dies. Not enough and it burns too hot and might send sparks flying. You need just the right amount, positioned just right, so the coals will smoulder through the night. And here's the thing, this knowledge was essential. A woman who couldn't properly bank a fire was a danger to her family. This wasn't optional skill, this was survival. One guide for housewives from 1747 stated, "The mistress of the house must personally see to the banking of the fire each night. This task is too important to delegate, for upon it depends the very safety of all who sleep under her roof." That's not hyperbole, that's literal truth. Sarah's skill at banking a fire could mean the difference between waking up safe and waking up to flames. But fire wasn't the only fear. There was also the darkness itself. And I don't mean darkness in the abstract poetic sense. I mean the absolute total darkness that existed beyond your small circle of light. Try to imagine this. You're in a house at night. Your one candle illuminates maybe a 6-foot radius around you. Everything beyond that is black. Not dim, not shadowy. Black. You can't see the far corners of your own room. You can't see out the windows, actually. You probably have shutters closed anyway. Because glass was expensive and drafts were real. You can't see down the hall, you certainly can't see outside. And in that darkness, sounds become magnified. Every creak of the house settling sounds like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounds like something moving. Every animal noise outside sounds like, what? A fox, a bear, a person? Because that's the other thing. In rural areas especially, you were isolated. Your nearest neighbour might be a mile away. If something happened, if someone meant you harm, there was no one to hear you call for help. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not suggesting that the 1700s were this lawless, dangerous time when everyone lived in constant terror. That's not accurate. Most communities were relatively safe. Most people were honest and helpful. But bad things did happen. Theft happened. Violence happened. And when you're a woman alone, or nearly with just children, and maybe a husband who's exhausted and asleep, that vulnerability was real. Historical records show that women did worry about this, especially women whose husbands travelled. A woman alone with children in an isolated house at night was in a genuinely vulnerable position. One woman in western Pennsylvania in 1770 wrote to her sister, "John is away 3 nights this week on militia duty. I confess I sleep poorly when he's gone. Every sound in the darkness makes me start. I keep the fireplace poker near the bed and wake at the smallest noise. She kept a fireplace poker near the bed as a weapon. That's not paranoia. That's reasonable precaution in a time and place where you were your own security system. And let's talk about the sounds themselves. Because in the silence of a 1700s night, sounds carried differently than they do now. We're surrounded by constant ambient noise, refrigerators humming, cars passing, heating systems running, electronics buzzing. Our brains filter it out, but it's always there. In the 1700s, nothing. Complete silence except for what nature or the house itself produced, which meant every sound was noticeable. The house creaking as temperature changed, wind in the trees, animals moving outside and sometimes inside because mice were common, rats were common, larger animals could get into outbuildings. A woman lying awake at night would hear all of this, and in the darkness, unable to see the source of the sound, her imagination would fill in the gaps. Is that just a shutter banging, or is someone trying to get in? Is that an animal in the bushes or a person moving around? This is the psychological reality that doesn't make it into history books. The everyday anxiety that came with darkness and isolation. The vigilance that was required just to feel safe enough to sleep. Sarah finishes her fire check. Everything seems secure. But before she can go to bed, there are a few more precautions. She checks the door. Not just that it's closed, but that the latch is secure. Many houses in this period didn't have locks. Actual keyed locks were expensive, but they had latches, bars, sometimes chains. Simple mechanisms that would at least slow down anyone trying to enter uninvited. She checks the windows. Are the shutters latched from inside? They should be for both security and insulation. But it's worth confirming. She looks in on the children one more time. Are they breathing? Are they covered? Are they safe? This nightly walkthrough is part security check, part prayer ritual. It's Sarah trying to control what little she can control, trying to create safety through preparation and vigilance, trying to convince herself that she's done everything possible to protect her family through the vulnerable hours of night. And here's what's heartbreaking. She knows it might not be enough. She knows that a fire can start despite all precautions. She knows that doors can be forced. She knows that illness can strike in the night without warning. She knows that a child can stop breathing despite being healthy when tucked in. The 1700s were a time when people had very little control over the dangers that threatened them. No fire departments, no police, no emergency medical care, no phones to call for help, no streetlights to make outdoor spaces safe. You had your own vigilance, your own preparation, your own prayers. That was it. That was all you could do. So when Sarah finally goes to bed, she doesn't rest easy. Part of her remains alert through the night, listening, waiting, ready to respond if something goes wrong. This is maternal vigilance carried to an extreme that most of us will never experience. But it was normal for women in the 1700s. The anxiety was just part of being responsible for your household safety. Let me share something from a diary that survived. It's from a woman named Rebecca Dickinson who lived in Massachusetts in the 1770s. She was actually unmarried, living alone, which made her situation even more vulnerable. She wrote, "The nights are the worst. In daylight I am busy and fear has no space to grow. But when darkness comes and I must extinguish my candle to save it, I lie in the black silence and every sound becomes a threat. I pray for morning, I pray for dawn to come quickly, I pray not to die in darkness. I pray not to die in darkness." That phrase haunts me, because it reveals a fear that was pervasive but rarely spoken. The fear that something terrible might happen in the night, that you might not see danger coming. That darkness itself was the enemy, and she was alone. Imagine how much worse that fear was, how much more acute the vulnerability. Of course, not everyone experienced this fear equally. Wealthy families in towns had advantages. They lived closer to neighbours. They might have servants sleeping in the house providing more people to respond to danger. They could afford better locks, stronger doors, more candles to keep some light burning through the night. Poor families, rural families, isolated families, they had the most to fear and the fewest resources to protect themselves. And enslaved people? They faced all these dangers plus the additional constant threat of violence from enslavers. Their nights were infinitely more dangerous than free people's nights. Any sound might be an overseer coming to check on them. Any visitor might mean punishment. They had no security at all, no safety, no rest. So when we talk about evening fears in the 1700s, we're talking about a spectrum of vulnerability. Some people had more protection than others, some people had more to fear than others, but everyone had some fear. Everyone felt some version of this vulnerability. Sarah is in bed now, finally. It's been maybe 19 hours since she woke. Her body is screaming for sleep, but her mind doesn't immediately quiet. She runs through her mental checklist one more time. Did she bank the fire properly? Are the children warm enough? Is the door secure? Did she remember to put the bread dough near the hearth so it will rise overnight? This is the invisible labour that never stops. Even in bed, even exhausted, even desperate for sleep, her mind is still working, still managing, still carrying the responsibility for everything and everyone. Her husband beside her is already asleep. He fell asleep within minutes of lying down, the sleep of someone who's done physical labour all day and whose responsibilities end when he closes his eyes. But Sarah's responsibilities don't end. They just shift from active to vigilant, from doing to watching, from working to worrying. This is the mental load that women carried in the 1700s, and honestly that many women still carry now. The constant background awareness of all the things that need managing, the inability to fully relax because some part of you is always on duty. Do you ever lie awake at night thinking through everything you need to do, running through mental checklists, worrying about things you might have forgotten, planning for potential problems? That's not new. That's not a modern phenomenon created by our busy lives. That's what humans, and especially women responsible for managing households, have always done. Sarah's checklist was different from yours. But the experience of lying in the dark, too tired to move but too anxious to sleep, running through endless mental lists, that's universal. That crosses centuries. And knowing that somehow makes me feel connected to her, to all the women who lay awake in the darkness, carrying the weight of their family's safety on their shoulders, doing invisible work that no one saw but everyone depended on. Eventually Sarah sleeps. She has to. Her body simply can't stay conscious any longer. But it's a light sleep, interrupted sleep. The kind where a small sound can wake you instantly, where you never quite reach the deep rest your body desperately needs. And in a few hours, too few hours, she'll wake again. The first light of dawn will come, and another day will begin. Another round of endless work will start. But right now, in these last moments before sleep finally claims her, Sarah exists in that strange liminal space between waking and dreaming, where the day's worries blend with the night's fears, where exhaustion meets vigilance, where being responsible for everything means never really resting from anything. This is what the end of evening looked like for women in the 1700s. Not peaceful, not restful, but necessary, survivable. One more night gotten through, one more dawn to be grateful for. And in these final moments of her evening, as consciousness finally fades, Sarah thinks about the sunrise that will come, the light that will return, the new day that will begin, because after the darkness always comes the morning, and morning means starting again. It means all the work she'll do, all the moments she'll navigate, all the evenings that will follow. But we're not quite done with this night yet. There's one more thing we need to understand about these ordinary evenings. One more layer to uncover. One more truth to acknowledge. Stay with me just a little longer. Let's make sure we see the whole picture before we let this night end. Here's the thing about surviving in the 1700s that no one really talks about. Tomorrow started tonight. Every single night, before a woman could rest, she had to build the framework for the next day. She had to create conditions that would make the morning manageable. She had to set up systems that would prevent chaos when dawn came. This wasn't optional. This wasn't being extra organized or particularly type A. This was survival strategy. This was the difference between a day that worked and a day that fell apart before it even began. And it happened in these final minutes before sleep, these last tasks. This quiet work that nobody saw but everybody benefited from. Let me show you what I mean. Sarah's exhausted. We've established that. She's been awake for 19, maybe 20 hours. Her body is begging for sleep. Every muscle aches. Her mind is foggy with fatigue, but she's not done yet, because there's one more round of preparation, one more set of tasks that will determine whether the morning is bearable or brutal. And here's what's interesting. This evening setup ritual was so ingrained, so automatic, that women rarely even wrote about it. It was like breathing. You just did it, every night, without thinking about it consciously. But historians who study household management have pieced together what this looked like. And when you see it all laid out, it's remarkable how much thought and planning went into those final minutes. First, let's talk about breakfast preparation. Remember, Sarah will need to have breakfast ready shortly after dawn. The family will be hungry, they'll need to eat before starting the day's work, and making breakfast from scratch at 5 or 6 in the morning when you're barely awake yourself, with a fire that needs rebuilding and water that needs fetching, that's a recipe for disaster. So Sarah prepares as much as she can the night before. If they're having porridge, which is likely, it's cheap and filling, she measures out the grain now, oats or cornmeal depending on what they have. She puts it in a bowl near the hearth where it will stay dry and accessible. If they're having leftover bread from today's baking, she sets it out on the table. If they're having eggs, she makes a mental note of how many eggs are in the coop and whether she'll need to collect them first thing. She checks the milk situation. Is there milk left from the evening milking? If not, milking the cow will be the first task of the morning, and she factors that into her timing. She makes sure the porridge pot is clean and ready to use, that the stirring spoon is in its place, that the bowls are stacked and accessible. All of this seems simple. But think about what it does. It removes decisions from the morning. When Sarah wakes up exhausted and groggy, she doesn't have to think. She just has to execute. The thinking happened tonight. The planning happened now. And here's something fascinating I discovered while researching this. Women's evening preparation strategies were actually documented and taught. There's a household management guide from 1764 called The Prudent Housewife's Guide to Daily Management that dedicates an entire chapter to evening preparations. It says, "The wise woman arranges her morning's work before she retires at night. She sets her breakfast table in the evening, lays out her cooking implements, prepares her ingredients, and considers her tasks in order. Thus she greets the dawn with confidence rather than confusion." Greets the dawn with confidence rather than confusion. That's exactly what this is about. Creating confidence through preparation. Controlling what little you can control. Next comes checking the water supply. Water is essential for morning tasks. You need it for cooking breakfast. You need it for washing. You need it for dozens of small tasks throughout the early morning. But fetching water is time-consuming and in winter miserable. Going out to the well or the stream in the cold darkness, hauling heavy buckets back, doing this before you've even had breakfast, it eats up precious morning time. So Sarah checks the water buckets now. Are they full? If not, should she fill them tonight, or will it be first thing in the morning? She makes that a calculation based on how tired she is versus how cold it will be at dawn. If she has teenage daughters, she might delegate this task. Mary, please fill the water buckets before you go to bed. Passing the work down the generation, teaching by doing, ensuring the next generation knows these rhythms, and she makes sure the buckets are positioned where they're needed. One near the hearth for cooking, one near the washing area, one by the door for quick access. Again, it's about removing friction from the morning, about making each task as easy as possible when you're too tired to think clearly. Then there's the matter of clothing and mending. Sarah does a quick mental inventory. Does her husband have a clean shirt for the work he'll be doing? Do the children have stockings without holes? Does anyone need something that requires last-minute attention? If there's a small mending task that absolutely must be done, she might do it now, by the dying firelight, even though her eyes are burning and her fingers are clumsy with exhaustion, because it's easier to spend 10 minutes now than to deal with a crisis in the morning when someone discovers they have nothing proper to wear, and she lays out items where they can be found easily. Children's clothes in order, her own work dress and apron accessible, everything positioned so mornings can happen with minimal chaos. One woman in New Hampshire in 1758 wrote in her diary, "I have learned that 5 minutes spent preparing the night before saves me 20 minutes of morning confusion. This mathematics of household management is perhaps my greatest skill." The mathematics of household management. I love that phrase, because that's exactly what it is. It's calculating where to invest time and energy to get the maximum return. It's strategy. It's planning. It's sophisticated resource management. And it was dismissed as just housework, as if it wasn't real skill, as if anyone could do it without thought or training. Sarah also checks the food storage situation. Is there enough bread for the week, or does she need to bake again? Are the preserved meats holding up, or is something starting to show signs of spoilage that needs to be used quickly? Is anything running low that needs to be acquired or made soon? She's not making detailed plans right now, she's too tired for that. But she's doing a quick scan, building awareness, so that when decisions need to be made, she already has the information. This is another form of mental labour that's invisible. Nobody sees her standing in front of the storage shelves for 30 seconds just looking. But in that 30 seconds, she's gathering data that will inform a dozen decisions over the next few days. The family thinks food just appears. They don't see the constant monitoring, the perpetual awareness of supplies and needs, the endless mental tracking of what needs doing and when. But Sarah knows. She knows that if she doesn't track it, nobody will. That if she doesn't stay aware, the family will run out of something essential at the worst possible moment. So she checks every night, even when she's exhausted, even when she'd rather just collapse into bed, she checks. And then there's one of the most important evening tasks, dealing with the next day's bread. Bread in the 1700s wasn't made fresh daily. That would be too labour-intensive. But bread dough needed to be started the night before if you wanted bread for the following day. So if Sarah determines tonight that they'll need fresh bread soon, she mixes the dough now. Flour, water, a bit of salt, and either sourdough starter or whatever leavening agent she has. She needs it, which takes strength and time when you're already exhausted. Then she places it in a bowl, covers it with a cloth, and sets it near the fire where the warmth will help it rise overnight. By morning, the dough will have doubled. She can shape it, let it rise again briefly, and bake it. The whole process is faster because she did the first stage tonight. But here's the thing. If she forgets to set the dough tonight, there's no bread tomorrow. The family just goes without, or she has to scramble to make something else. Or she has to go through the entire bread-making process from scratch in the morning, when she's already dealing with a dozen other tasks. So setting the bread dough is non-negotiable. It's one of those evening tasks that absolutely must happen, regardless of fatigue. One woman's diary from 1749 records, "So weary I could scarce stand, but the bread dough cared not for my weariness. I set it as I must, for the family will eat regardless of my exhaustion." That's the reality. The work doesn't care how tired you are. It demands to be done anyway. Now Sarah does something that seems almost ritualistic. She walks through the house one more time. Not for fire safety, she did that check already. This is different. This is a final scan, a last look at the day's stage to make sure everything is set for the next performance. She looks at the main room. Is it reasonably tidy? Not perfect, she's too tired for perfect, but functional, ready to be used again when the family wakes. She looks toward the kitchen area. Are her morning implements in place? Can she move through the breakfast routine without searching for things? She checks the door one final time, latched, secure. She looks in on the sleeping children, still breathing, still safe, thank God. And then, only then, does she finally allow herself to go to bed. But here's something that breaks my heart a little. Even as she's lying down, even as exhaustion's pulling her towards sleep, part of her brain is still working because the mental preparation doesn't stop. Her mind is already running through the morning sequence. Milk the cow, start the fire, heat water, make porridge, wake the children, get them dressed, feed them, start the day's work. It's an automatic mental rehearsal, a habit so deeply ingrained that she does it without even meaning to. And this is something modern researchers have studied actually. They've found that people who carry high mental loads, who are responsible for managing complex systems, often can't shut off their planning brains even when they desperately need rest. Women in the 1700s didn't have research papers about this, but they lived it. They knew what it felt like to be so tired your body can barely move, but your mind won't stop running through lists and plans and preparations. One woman wrote to her sister in 1776, "I lie abed exhausted, yet my mind races on, planning the morrow. I cannot cease thinking even when I most desire to cease. Is this the price of keeping a household, this inability to rest truly?" Yes, that was the price. That is the price. For many women, it still is. You know what strikes me about all of this? The sheer amount of invisible labour involved in just keeping a household functioning. We've spent hours now exploring one evening, one ordinary evening in October 1743, and we've barely scratched the surface of everything Sarah had to think about, manage, monitor, and do. The cooking, the textile work, the childcare, the entertaining, the safety checks, the preparation for the next day, the mental planning, the constant awareness, the perpetual responsibility. And this was every evening, every single one, for her entire adult life. She didn't get evenings off, she didn't get to just relax after a hard day, because relaxing meant falling behind, and falling behind meant chaos, and chaos meant her family suffering. So she worked until she literally couldn't stay conscious any longer. And then she slept lightly, vigilantly, ready to wake if needed. And then she got up and did it all again. And here's the most devastating part. Nobody thanked her for it. Her husband didn't thank her for the breakfast that appeared each morning because he didn't see the evening preparation that made it possible. Her children didn't thank her for the clean clothes and organised mornings because they assumed that's just how life was. Her community didn't recognise the skill and labour involved because it happened invisibly, in the privacy of her home, after dark when no one was watching. The United States Census from 1790 through 1820 specifically instructed census takers not to record household manufacturing done by women. Their work was officially invisible, officially uncounted, officially meaningless in the economic sense. But unofficially, their work was the foundation everything else was built on. Without women doing this invisible evening labour, nothing else could function. The farm work couldn't happen because workers wouldn't be fed. The businesses couldn't run because no one would have clean clothes or organised households to come home to. Everything depended on women's work, and women's work was treated as if it didn't count. Sarah's finally asleep now, or mostly asleep. That light, vigilant sleep of someone who's always on call. She's prepared everything she can, done everything that needs doing, set up the morning for success as much as possible. And when dawn comes, which will be soon, too soon, she'll wake and do it all again. The endless cycle, the perpetual labour, the invisible work that makes visible life possible. But before we finish this night, before we let Sarah rest, there's one more conversation we need to have. One more truth we need to face about these ordinary evenings in the 1700s. Because everything we've seen tonight, all this labour, all this skill, all this invisible work, it reveals something profound about women's lives then, and honestly, about women's lives now. And that's what we need to talk about next. The big picture, the patterns, the truths that span centuries. Stay with me, we're almost at the end of this long night. Let's make sure we understand what it all means. Let's talk about what happened in Sarah's body after 19 or 20 hours of continuous responsibility. Because we've followed her through this entire October evening in 1743, we've watched her manage supper, spin wool, put children to bed, prepare for guests, check for dangers, plan for the morning. We've seen the visible work and the invisible work, the physical labour and the mental load. But we haven't really sat with what that did to her physically, what it felt like in her bones, what exhaustion at that level actually means. So let's be honest about it now. Let's look at the toll. Sarah's feet hurt. That's the first thing. They've been carrying her weight since before dawn. Walking from room to room, standing at the hearth, moving between tasks, in shoes that offer minimal cushioning, leather soles on wooden or dirt floors, no arch support, no ergonomic design. By evening, her feet are swollen. The leather shoes that fit fine in the morning are now tight. Her toes ache. Her heels are probably blistered in spots. If she takes off her shoes, which she finally does just before bed, the relief is so intense it's almost painful. Historical accounts actually mention this. Women's foot problems were considered a common affliction. One medical text from 1752 lists aching and swelling of the feet as one of the primary complaints of housewives, and it recommends soaking them in warm water with herbs. But Sarah doesn't have time for that. She just takes off the shoes, rubs her feet briefly, and gets into bed. The aching will ease once she's lying down, or at least it won't demand her attention anymore. Her back hurts too. That constant dull ache in the lower back from bending over the hearth, from carrying water buckets, from leaning over the spinning wheel for hours, from all the lifting and bending and reaching that her day required. Women in the 1700s didn't have chiropractors or physical therapy. They didn't have ergonomic furniture or awareness of proper lifting techniques. They just lived with the pain. Chronic back pain was so common it was barely worth mentioning. One woman in her diary in 1767 wrote simply, "My back pains me always now. I'm 32 years old and feel like an old woman." 32, feeling old. Because 2 decades of constant physical labour had worn her body down. And Sarah is 40-something. She's been doing this work for even longer. Her back has been hurting for years. She barely notices it anymore except in those first few moments of lying down, when the muscles finally get to release and the relief is so profound she could weep. Her hands are another story. Rough, calloused, cracked. The skin around her nails is damaged from working with water and wool and dough and fire. There are probably small burns from checking bread in the oven, or adjusting pots over the fire. There are cuts from kitchen knives or from sharp edges on tools. Women's hands in the 1700s were working hands. There were damaged hands. They hurt almost constantly, though the pain was so familiar it became background noise. But at night, in bed, when there's nothing else to distract from it, Sarah feels the ache in her finger joints, the stiffness, the inflammation from repetitive motions done thousands of times. Modern doctors would probably diagnose her with early arthritis, with repetitive strain injuries, with various forms of chronic pain that have names now but were just the way it is then. She has no treatment, no pain relief except maybe a bit of willow bark tea if the pain is truly unbearable. But mostly she just lives with it, because what choice does she have? And then there's the exhaustion that goes beyond physical, the bone-deep weariness that comes from being needed constantly, from having no moment that truly belongs to you, from carrying responsibility for everything and everyone. This is different from being tired after a hard workout or a long day at work. This is the exhaustion of someone who can never fully rest, who sleeps with one ear always listening, who wakes if a child stirs, whose mind never stops planning and worrying and managing. Modern research has shown that chronic stress, the kind that comes from constant vigilance and unrelenting responsibility, actually changes your brain chemistry. It affects your sleep quality. It impacts your physical health. It shortens your lifespan. Women in the 1700s didn't have this research, but they felt the effects. They knew what it was to be tired beyond tiredness. To reach a level of exhaustion where your body is heavy and your thoughts are slow and even simple tasks feel overwhelming. And here's what gets me. They had to do it all again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. There was no day off, no weekend, no vacation, no I need a mental health day option. Sundays were supposed to be days of rest, but women still had to cook, still had to care for children, still had to do the essential minimum to keep the household functioning. So Sunday was lighter work, but it was still work. Illness might force a day in bed. But even then, if you had children, you were still needed. You were still responsible. You might rest your body, but your mind couldn't fully rest because who was taking care of everything? The work was relentless. The responsibility was unending. The exhaustion was cumulative, building year after year until it became the baseline state of existence. Let me share something from a letter that's been preserved. It's from a woman named Abigail Adams. Yes, that Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, who would become the second president of the United States. In 1763, when she was 19 years old and newly married, she wrote to her friend, "I find the duties of housekeeping more arduous than I had imagined. There is no moment's pause. I am exhausted by evening, yet cannot rest, for there is always something more requiring attention. How do women endure this for decades? I have been married mere months and already feel the weight of perpetual labour." This is Abigail Adams, a woman who would go on to be one of the most famous and accomplished women in American history. An intellectual, a political advisor, a brilliant correspondent. And at 19 she was already struggling with the weight of household management. If Abigail Adams found it overwhelming, imagine what it was like for women without her education, her resources, her eventual fame. Actually, we don't have to imagine. We have their letters and diaries, and they tell us. It was crushing, it was relentless, it aged women prematurely, it consumed their lives. But here's the thing that's both beautiful and tragic. Women endured. They found ways to survive. They developed coping strategies. They supported each other. They took pride in their competence. They found moments of joy despite the burden. They weren't just victims of an oppressive system, though the system was absolutely oppressive. They were also skilled managers, strategic thinkers, resilient humans who adapted to brutal circumstances and made lives worth living, despite everything. And I think it's important to hold both of those truths at once. Yes, their lives were unjustly hard. Yes, they deserved better. Yes, the system that made their work invisible and undervalued was wrong. And also, yes, they were remarkable. They were capable. They were intelligent. They were strong in ways we can barely comprehend. Both things can be true. Sarah lies in bed now, her body finally still. The aches and pains are there, but they're familiar, almost comforting in their consistency. Her mind is beginning to slow, though it's still running through lists, still planning, still managing, even as consciousness fades. And I want you to really think about what her day has been. Really add it up. She woke before dawn, rekindled the fire, made breakfast, fed the family, cleaned up, tended animals, prepared and served dinner, cleaned up again, spun wool for 2 hours, supervised her daughter's work, made and served supper, put children to bed, checked the house for fire hazards, planned the next morning, set bread dough, did a dozen other small tasks we haven't even named. 19 hours, maybe 20, of continuous, unrelenting responsibility, and she'll do it again after sleeping maybe 6 hours. If she's lucky, if no one needs her in the night, if she doesn't lie awake worrying. Can you imagine living like that? Not for a day or a week, but for decades? From the day you married until the day you died or became too old to work. And the worst part, the part that makes me most angry, is that it was treated as if it didn't matter. As if it was easy. As if any woman could do it without skill or thought. Women's work, said dismissively, as if that phrase explained everything and excused not looking closer. As if being labelled women's work meant it didn't require intelligence or strength or training, but we've seen what it actually involved. We've walked through one evening and witnessed the complexity, the skill, the strategic thinking, the constant management, the physical endurance, the emotional labour, the vigilance, the preparation, the planning was sophisticated, it was essential, it was skilled labour of the highest order, and it was invisible, unpaid, unrecognised, taken for granted. Men could retire from field work when they got old, could pass farms to sons, could rest in their later years, secure at the respect they'd earned. Women worked until they physically couldn't anymore, and even then they were expected to contribute what they could. There was no retirement from housework, no pension for mothers, no recognition of decades of labour. You just worked until you died. And if you were lucky, your daughter or daughter-in-law would take care of you in your final years. But even that care was just more women's invisible work. I want to tell you about one more woman. Her name was Elizabeth Drinker, and she lived in Philadelphia in the late 1700s. She kept a diary for 51 years, from 1758 until her death in 1807. In her final entries, when she was 73 years old and knew she was dying, she wrote, "I have kept house for 50 years. I have raised 9 children, though only 5 survived. I have managed servants and budgets and crises without number. I have been a good wife and a good mother and a good household manager. And yet I wonder, what record remains of all this labour? My husband's business dealings are documented. My son's achievements are known. But what mark have I left? Who will remember the work of my hands, the planning of my mind, the constant vigilance of my heart? Who will remember? That's the question, isn't it? Who remembers the women who did this work? Who recognises what they gave? Who honours the skill and strength and intelligence they demonstrated daily? For most women in the 1700s, the answer was no one. Their work disappeared the moment it was done. Their exhaustion was invisible. Their contributions were taken for granted. But we remember now. That's why we're here tonight, walking through this ordinary evening with Sarah. Because someone needs to see. Someone needs to witness. Someone needs to say this mattered. You mattered. What you did was remarkable, and it shouldn't have been invisible. So Sarah, lying exhausted in her bed in October 1743, her body aching and her mind still racing, we see you. We recognise what you did. We understand what it cost. and to every woman who lived this life in every century, in every place, we see you too. Your work wasn't invisible, not really, it was just ignored, and that's different. The work existed, the skill existed, the exhaustion existed, the contribution existed. It was always there, always valuable, always essential. People just chose not to look. But we're looking now, and what we see is extraordinary. What we see is strength beyond measure, intelligence beyond recognition, endurance beyond what should be asked of anyone. And as Sarah finally drifts into sleep, as this long October evening finally ends, as we prepare to close this window into the past, there's one more thing we need to acknowledge. One more truth we need to speak before we let the night end. Because this story of women's evening labour in the 1700s, it's not just history. It echoes forward. It connects to now. It helps us understand something important about the world we live in. And that's what we're going to talk about in these final moments. That's the conversation we need to have before we close. Stay with me just a little longer. We're almost at dawn. Almost at the end of the night, almost at understanding what it all means. The sun is starting to rise now, not in 1743. We'll leave Sarah to her too short sleep, but here now, as we finish this journey through one ordinary evening. And I want to talk about why this matters, why we've spent hours walking through the details of supper and spinning and candle making and bedtime rituals. Why it's important to see these ordinary moments that history mostly forgot. Because here's the truth. The story of women's evening work in the 1700s isn't just about the past, it's about understanding patterns that echo through time. It's about recognizing labour that's still invisible. It's about seeing what we've been taught not to see. Let me explain what I mean. Everything we've witnessed tonight, the endless work, the mental load, the invisible preparation, the constant vigilance, the physical exhaustion, the lack of recognition, all of it still exists. The details have changed, the tools have changed. But the fundamental dynamic, that's remarkably similar. Women today don't spin wool by candlelight, but they do what's called the second shift. Coming home from paid work to begin the unpaid work of managing a household. Cooking, cleaning, organising, planning, tracking everyone's schedules, doing the emotional labour of maintaining family relationships. And just like in the 1700s, this work is still largely invisible, still undervalued, still treated as if it's not real labour because it happens in the home. A study from 2019, yes, 2019, not 1819, found out that women still do an average of 4.5 hours per day of unpaid domestic work, compared to men's 2.8 hours. That's nearly 2 hours more every single day. Multiply that across a year, across a lifetime. The numbers are staggering. And that's just the measurable work. That doesn't count the mental load, the planning, the remembering, the anticipating, the constant background awareness of what needs doing. Sound familiar? Here's what really struck me while researching this. The phrases women use now to describe their evenings are almost identical to phrases from the 1700s. I can't stop thinking about everything I need to do. My mind won't shut off even when I'm exhausted. I feel like I'm the only one who sees what needs doing. If I don't do it, it won't get done. I'm tired of being tired. These could be from Sarah's diary in 1743, or from a Reddit post yesterday. The words are the same because the experience is the same. The technology changed, the setting changed, but the invisible labour, that persisted, and that should make us angry. Not at individual men, though some deserve it, but at systems that have, for centuries, benefited from women's unpaid labour while refusing to recognise or value it. But here's where I want to be careful, because I don't want this to be just a story of oppression. I don't want to leave you feeling hopeless. Yes, the patterns persist. Yes, there's injustice. Yes, we have work to do, but also yes, things have changed. And they've changed because women and men who supported them fought to make them change. Women can own property now, can vote, can work outside the home and control their own earnings, can choose whether to marry, whether to have children, how to structure their lives. These are enormous victories that our ancestors couldn't even imagine. And the conversation about domestic labour has shifted dramatically even in the past decade. Terms like mental load and emotional labour have entered mainstream discourse. People are naming the invisible work, seeing it, demanding that it be shared more equitably. That's progress, real progress. Progress that women in the 1700s would have found miraculous. So we honour the past by acknowledging how hard it was, and we honour the present by recognising both how far we've come and how far we still need to go. There's something else I want you to take from this story, something beyond the gender dynamics and the labour politics. It's this: ordinary lives matter. Everyday moments matter. The small repetitive tasks that seem insignificant, they're actually the foundation everything else is built on. History tends to focus on the extraordinary, the battles and the laws and the famous speeches and the great men doing great things, and those matter, absolutely. But so does the woman making sure breakfast appears every morning, the mother checking on sleeping children, the household manager preparing for the next day, the spinner creating the thread that becomes the clothes that keep everyone warm. These ordinary acts, repeated millions of times by millions of women across centuries, they're what made civilization possible. They're what allowed those great men to do their great things. Because someone was making sure they were fed and clothed and their households were running. The extraordinary rests on the ordinary, always has, always will, and the ordinary deserves to be seen, respected, valued. When I started researching this topic, I thought I was just learning about history, about how people lived in the past, and I was. But I also learned something about how to look at the present, how to see the invisible labour that's happening around me right now, how to recognise and appreciate work that our culture tells us doesn't count. I notice now when someone has prepared something in advance to make my life easier. I see the evening clean-up after a gathering. I recognise the planning that goes into making mornings run smoothly. I understand that it just happens actually means someone made it happen. And I try, imperfectly, but I try to do my share, to see what needs doing without being asked, to recognise that planning and mental load are work, not just the execution of tasks. That's what this story gave me. Different way of seeing, a deeper appreciation, a recognition of labour I'd been trained to ignore, and maybe that's what it can give you too. So let's come back to Sarah one last time. She's sleeping now, finally, her body getting the rest it desperately needs, even if it's not enough. Her mind quieter, though still not completely still, and when dawn comes, which it will inevitably, she'll wake and begin again, another day of endless work, another evening of the same, but she's not just surviving, she's also living, finding moments of connection with her daughters as they spin together, taking pride in bread well baked, singing to her children, writing letters to her sister, managing her household with skill that took decades to develop. She's building a life within the constraints she was given, making it bearable, sometimes even making it beautiful. And that's not nothing, that's actually everything, because that's what humans do. We survive impossibly hard circumstances, we find joy in small moments, we create meaning even when the world tells us our work doesn't matter. We keep going because we must, but also because we can. Sarah would never call herself extraordinary. If you asked her, she'd say she was just doing what needed doing, what any woman would do, but we know better. We've seen the complexity, the skill, the endurance, the intelligence, the love. We know that what she did was remarkable, even if she never knew it herself. And this is true for countless women across history whose names we don't know, whose work was never recorded, whose contributions were taken for granted or ignored entirely. They lived, they worked, they cared, they managed, they created, they endured. And then they died and were forgotten. Their work disappeared as if it had never existed. But it did exist. It mattered. It was the foundation everything else was built on. And we remember now. Maybe we can't name them. Maybe we don't have their diaries or letters. Maybe their specific stories are lost. But we remember that they were there, that they did this work, that it counted. We see you, all of you, across century years, across continents. Every woman who worked until exhaustion, every mother who checked on sleeping children, every household manager who prepared the next day while falling asleep on her feet. Your work mattered. You mattered. The labour of your hands and hearts and minds. It built the world we live in today. Thank you. Thank you for what you gave. Thank you for what you endured. Thank you for keeping going when everything was hard and no one was watching. We see you now, and we won't forget again. So here we are, at the end of this long evening, at the end of this journey through October 1743. We started at sunset watching Sarah race against fading light, and we followed her through every task, every moment, every decision of her evening. We've seen the visible work and the invisible work, the physical labour and the mental load, the social performance and the private fear, the strategic planning and the constant vigilance. We've seen it all, and in seeing it, we've understood something important about both the past and the present. That work that happens in the home, in the evening and the quiet moments, it's not less important than other work. It's not unskilled. It's not easy. It's not something that just happens naturally. It's labour. Skilled, essential, exhausting labour. It always has been. And recognising that, truly seeing it, truly valuing it, that changes how we understand history, how we understand our own lives, how we understand what we owe to each other. I want to thank you for taking this journey with me tonight, for spending hours in the dim candlelight of the 1700s, for caring about these ordinary moments and these extraordinary women. This isn't the kind of history that makes it into most textbooks. These aren't the stories we're usually told, but they're important stories. They're true stories. They're stories that help us understand where we came from and where we are now, and I hope they've changed how you see things. I hope when you walk through your own evening now, you might notice the invisible work happening around you, or the work you're doing that others don't see. I hope you'll recognise it, value it, maybe even share it more equitably, because that's how change happens, not just through big political movements, though those matter too, but through individual people choosing to see differently, to value differently, to act differently, one evening at a time, one recognition at a time, one moment of appreciation at a time. The dawn is here now. In our time, not Sarah's, the night is ending, but the story doesn't end. Because there are always more stories, more ordinary evenings that deserve to be witnessed, more invisible labour that needs to be seen, more women whose work matters even though history forgot to write it down. And I'll be here searching for those stories, bringing them into the light, helping us see what we've been taught not to see. So if you've found value in this journey, if this story meant something to you, stay close. There will be more stories, more evenings, more moments of recognition and understanding. Subscribe if you haven't already, not for my sake, but for the sake of these stories, because every person who listens is another witness, another person who sees, another voice that says, this work mattered, these lives mattered, we remember. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us remember the invisible labour of the past, we'll finally start truly seeing and valuing the invisible labour of the present. For now, though, let's let Sarah sleep. She's earned it. Tomorrow will come soon enough for her, with all its demands and duties, but right now, in these last hours before dawn, she can rest. And so can we. We've witnessed. We've understood. We've remembered. That's enough for tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these ordinary evenings and these extraordinary women. Until next time, may your evenings be gentle. May your labour be seen. May you rest well and wake renewed. And may we all carry forward what we've learned here, that every life matters, every task matters, every moment of care and work and love matters, even when no one is watching, even when history doesn't record it, even when the world tells us it doesn't count. It counts. It always counted. It always will. Good night, and thank you.